Margaret Collins dropped her suitcase in the dirt and walked straight toward the horse that had just put a grown man on his back. Blood ran down Del Freeman's face, while two ranch hands dragged him under the fence rail, and the black mare screamed and struck the empty air with both front hooves. "Get back, you fool woman!" Caleb Turner roared. Margaret didn't stop. She stepped through the corral gate in her travel dress unarmed and pulled it shut behind her. The whole ranch went dead silent, and the mare turned to face her. Before we go any further, if you believe some people are far stronger than the world ever gave them credit for, take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel and follow Margaret's story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments what town or city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the morning it all began. The stagecoach had been rattling west for 3 days when the driver finally reined up and called out that Red Hollow was the last stop before the mountains ate the road. Margaret gathered her small suitcase and the letter folded inside her glove and stepped down into a wind that smelled of dust and cattle and something burnt. The driver looked her over the way most people did, slow. From the hem of her faded blue dress up to the worn beige apron she'd tied over it for the journey, and then to her face, and then away. "You sure this is where you meant to go, ma'am?" he asked. "I'm sure. Hawthorne Ranch is a hard place, harder than most." "I've been to hard places," Margaret said. "I buried one 3 weeks ago." The driver didn't have anything to say to that. He tipped his hat, climbed back up, and left her standing alone at the edge of a town that had already decided what it thought of her. She heard the laughter before she reached the mercantile. Two women on the boardwalk had their heads bent together, and one of them said something that made the other cover her mouth, and both of them looked at Margaret's body the way you look at a wagon that's stuck in the mud. Something to shake your head at. Something in the way. Margaret kept walking. She had learned a long time ago that you do not give people your hurt to hold. They'll only weigh you down with it later. So she carried her own the way she carried the suitcase, in one steady hand. "You lost honey," one of the women called out, the taller of the two, with a voice pitched, sweet as poison. "The Eaton House is that way if you're hungry. Looks like you might be." The other one laughed behind her hand. Margaret stopped. She turned, and she looked at the tall woman long enough that the sweetness started to curdle right there on her face. "I've eaten worse than what your kind serves," Margaret said, quiet and even. "I've eaten grief for 3 weeks straight, and I'm still standing here on my own 2 feet, which is more than most could say. So no, ma'am, I'm not lost. I know exactly where I'm going." She let that settle. Question is whether you've got anywhere to be, or whether laughing at a stranger's the whole of your afternoon. The tall woman opened her mouth and found nothing in it. Her friend had already stopped laughing. Margaret picked her suitcase back up and went on to the mercantile and asked the man sweeping the porch where she might find the road out to Hawthorne Land. He pointed north with his broom and said, 2 miles. But they ain't hiring misses. Least of all a—" He stopped himself. "Least of all a woman my size." Margaret finished for him. "You can say it. It don't break anything I haven't already carried." The man's face went red, and he went back to his sweeping, and Margaret walked north. The 2 miles took her the better part of an hour, and she used every minute of it. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the little house they'd rented outside Cheyenne, and the way he used to hum when he mended tack, and the fever that took him so fast, the doctor never even had time to lie to her about his chances. She thought about the debt he'd left her, honest debt, the kind that comes from bad seasons and worse luck, and how the bank had been so very polite when they took the house. And she thought about her father, dead these 10 years, who had trained horses for a living, and taught his daughter that you never break an animal. You listen to it long enough that it stops needing to be afraid of you. By the time the gates of Hawthorne Ranch rose up out of the dust, Margaret Collins had her back straight, and her chin level, and her whole heart nailed down tight where nobody could get at it. The first ranch hand who saw her laughed out loud. He was a lean, sharp-faced man of maybe 30, with a hat pushed back and a piece of straw in his teeth, and he called over his shoulder to the others by the barn. "Boys, come look. They sent us a cook, and she brought enough of herself to feed the herd. 3 of them came. They stood in a loose half-circle and looked at her, and Margaret set her suitcase down in the dirt and looked right back. "I'm here to see Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "I have a letter." "Course you do," the sharp-faced one said. His name, she'd learned soon enough, was Roy Danswell, and there was a meanness in him that ran deeper than most. "Everybody's got a letter. Don't mean the work'll have you. You know what we do out here, Mrs. We rope, we ride, we wrestle steers twice your weight into the branding chute. You reckon you're gonna do that?" "I reckon I'll do whatever's put in front of me," Margaret said. Roy grinned at the others. "She reckons." He stepped in a little closer, close enough that a smaller woman might have stepped back, and Margaret didn't. "You want to know what I think, Mrs.? I think you read some story in a paper about the West being full of lonesome ranchers wanting wives, and you figured you'd come try your luck before your looks ran all the way out. That about the size of it." "No," Margaret said. "No. I came for work, mister. I don't believe I caught your name." "Danswell. Roy Danswell." "I came for work, Mr. Danswell. I've had one husband, and I loved him, and I buried him, and I'm not in the market for a second. But I'll tell you what I am in the market for." She set her chin. "A day's pay for a day's labor, same as you. And I'll wager I'll still be forking hay long after you've talked yourself hoarse." One of the other hands laughed, and it wasn't at her, and Roy heard the difference. His grin went tight. "Let her be Roy." That came from a younger hand at the back, barely more than a boy with a soft face he hadn't grown into yet. Samuel, his name was. "Shut it, Sam." "Roy." A new voice, older and flat and used to being obeyed, cut across the yard. The men straightened up. Caleb Turner came across the packed dirt with the rolling walk of a man who'd spent 40 years mostly in a saddle. He was hard through the shoulders and hard through the face, and there was gray coming into his mustache, and he looked at Margaret the way he'd have looked at a fence post someone had left in the middle of the road. "You're the one wrote about work," he said. It wasn't a question. "Margaret Collins." She held out the letter. He didn't take it. "I'll save you the walk back, Mrs. Collins. This land breaks people stronger than you. I've watched it do it. Big men mean men who could throw a calf one-handed and ride a green colt till sundown. It ground them down to nothing, and they left in the night so nobody'd see their faces." He shifted his weight. "I don't say it to be cruel. I say it because I'd rather tell you now than bury you later. Go home." Margaret held the letter out a moment longer. Then she lowered it. "Mr. Turner," she said, and her voice didn't shake. "I don't have a home to go back to. The bank has it. My husband's in the ground. And I've got exactly what you see standing here, and a father's worth of knowing my way around animals, and a stubbornness that has outlasted every single thing that ever tried to end it." She took a breath. "So don't give me the chance because I'm strong. Give it to me because I refuse to quit. Those aren't the same thing, and the second one's the one that'll still be standing when your strong men have gone home in the dark." Roy laughed again, but it came out thinner than before. Caleb Turner looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, and then it was gone, buried back under 40 years of hard. "That's not my call," he said finally. "It's his." He turned and walked toward the main house, and after a second Margaret picked up her suitcase and followed, and behind her she heard Roy mutter, $10 says she's gone by Thursday. And another man take the bet. William Hawthorne was in the barn doorway when they came up, and he was not what Margaret expected. She'd braced herself for another Roy, or another Caleb, and what she got was a man in his middle 30s, with quiet eyes, and a stillness to him, the kind of stillness that comes to a person who has learned to listen before he speaks. He had a coil of rope over one shoulder, and dust to his elbows, and he took his hat off when he saw a woman, which not one man in that yard had thought to do. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne, this is Mrs. Collins," Caleb said. "She wrote about the hand position. I told her the truth of it. She wants to hear it from you." William looked at Margaret. He did not look her up and down. He looked at her face, and then at her hands, which were not the soft hands of a woman who'd never worked, and then back at her face. "You've done ranch work?" he asked. Farm work, horses mostly. My father traded and trained. I kept his books, and I gentled the ones nobody else could sit. She paused. And I can cook, and I can mend, and I can pull a calf if it comes to that. I'm not asking you to believe me, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm asking you to watch me. Roy had drifted up close enough to hear, and he snorted. Boss, you can't be... Roy, William said not loudly. Go check the south water. But, go check the south water. Roy went, and he went angry, and Margaret filed that away without meaning to, the way her father had taught her to notice which horse pinned its ears when the others were fed. William turned back to her. 1 week, he said. You do the work the same as any hand, same hours, no allowances. If at the end of the week, Caleb tells me you've earned your place, you've got it. If not, I'll pay you for the week and put you on the coach myself. Fair. Fair, Margaret said. There's one more thing. He looked toward the far end of the yard, toward a corral set apart from the others, and something crossed his face that she couldn't yet read. But it can wait. Caleb will show you the bunk situation. There's a room off the kitchen. It's small. It's a roof, Margaret said. That's more than I had this morning. And for just a second, the corner of William Hawthorne's mouth moved like a smile that hadn't decided yet whether it was allowed to come out. The room off the kitchen was small, and it was cold, and it was hers. And Margaret sat on the narrow bed that first night and took Thomas's letter out from where she kept it against her heart. It wasn't the letter she'd shown Caleb. That one was just references a widow woman's paper credentials. This one was the last thing Thomas ever wrote her propped on the washstand the morning the fever took his mind, and it said, only in a hand gone shaky. You are the strongest thing I ever loved. Don't let them tell you different. Go west if you have to. Just don't stop. She read it once. She folded it up. She did not cry because she had cried herself empty 3 weeks ago, and there was nothing left to spend, and in the morning she went to work. She was up before the men. She had the stove going and coffee on, and a pan of biscuits in, before Caleb Turner came stamping in out of the dark, expecting an empty kitchen. And he stopped in the doorway and looked at the biscuits, and looked at her and said nothing at all, and took his coffee and went out. Then she went out to the work. She mucked stalls until her arms shook. She forked hay. She hauled water. When they set her to mending fence along the east line, Roy made sure to give her the stretch that ran through the brambles, and she came back at noon with her forearms scratched to ribbons, and she never said a word about it. She learned the names of the horses. She learned which of the milk cows kicked. She endured. On the second day, Roy set her to move a young roan gelding from the near pen to the far one, and he did it grinning, because he'd cinched the lead knot down to where a body would have to fight it loose, and because that roan had a habit of bolting sideways the second he felt a pull. Roy leaned on the rail with 2 other hands to watch the fat widow get dragged through the dirt. Margaret took one look at the gelding's ears and the white of his eye, and she didn't pull the lead at all. She let it go slack. She turned her shoulder to him the way you turn from a shy dog, and she walked slow toward the far pen without once looking back, and the roan, having nothing to fight, followed her like she'd raised him from a foal. Huh, said one of the hands. Roy spat. Fool luck. But her father's voice was in her head the whole while, plain as if he stood beside her. A horse. It'll go anywhere you're going, girl. Long as you make going with you the easy thing and fighting you the hard one. That's the whole secret. There ain't a second one. Later that same day, she was hauling a full water bucket past the branding chute when a steer they were working came off the fence wrong and swung its head, and a horn caught the bucket and near tore her arm from the socket, and she went down hard in the dust with water everywhere and the steer stamping. Roy laughed so hard he had to hold the rail. Samuel came running, but Margaret was already up on her own, one hand pressed to her shoulder, and she waved the boy off before he reached her. I'm fine, Sam. Ma'am, your arm is still on. Get back to it before Roy finds a reason to say we're both slow. She picked up the empty bucket. And thank you for coming. I saw who ran and who didn't. She never mentioned the shoulder to a soul, though it ached her a week, and she never gave Roy Danswell the pleasure of a single complaint, and that more than the biscuits or the fence or the roan was what started to turn the quieter men. The endurance was the hard part, and it had nothing to do with the labor. "You know what they do to horses that can't earn their feed?" Roy asked her the second day, leaning on the corral rail while she filled the trough. "They put 'em down, kinder that way. Don't have to watch 'em suffer being useless." Margaret kept filling the trough. "You hear me, missus? I hear you fine Mr. Danswell," she said. "I'm just deciding whether you're worth the water it'd take to answer you." Samuel, the young one, laughed before he could stop himself, and Roy shot him a look that killed the laugh dead, and Margaret went on with her work. But it wasn't all of them. That was the thing she'd learn about Hawthorne Ranch, the thing that would matter later. It was Roy mostly, and 2 or 3 who followed him because it was easier than not. But there was Samuel, who started leaving the gates unlatched on her side, so she wouldn't have to set down her load to open them. There was old Josiah, the cook's helper, who showed her where the good tools were kept, so she wouldn't be handed the broken ones. There was even Caleb, though. Caleb would have died before he admitted it, who stopped giving her the bramble stretch of fence after the 3rd day and never said why. It was Josiah who talked to her those first evenings when the rest of them left her be. He was near 70 and bent in the hip, and he'd been on Hawthorne land since it was Hawthorne's father's land, and he peeled potatoes beside her at the kitchen board and told her things the others wouldn't. "You want to watch that Danswell," he said low. "He's mean, but that ain't the trouble with him. The trouble is, he's mean and scared, and the two together in a man make him spiteful past reason. He came here 3 winters back with nothing same as you. Boss took him on, and Roy's never once forgave a soul for seeing him at his lowest." Josiah dropped a peeled potato in the pot. "So when he looks at you, missus, what he sees is what he was. And there's nothing a small man hates worse than a mirror." "He's not scared of me," Margaret said. "He's scared of what you're proving, that a body can start with nothing and not turn hard doing it." Josiah looked at her sideways. "You didn't turn hard. I can tell. Whatever you lost, and I'd guess it was plenty." Margaret's knife slowed on the potato. "My husband," she said. "Thomas, 3 weeks and some days ago." She didn't often say it out loud, and it sat strange in her mouth. "Fever. It took him in 6 days. Monday he was mending my saddle and singing, and Sunday I was choosing the words for a stone I couldn't afford to buy." She set the knife down. "We had a little place, nothing grand. But it was ours, and we were happy in it in the small ways that don't make a story. And when he was gone, the bank came, and it turned out happy doesn't count for anything on a ledger." "No," Josiah agreed. "It don't, more's the pity. He left me a letter." Margaret picked the knife back up because her hands needed something to do. "The last morning before the fever took his sense. He wrote that I was the strongest thing he ever loved, and I wasn't to let anybody tell me different. And then he wrote, 'Go west if you have to. Just don't stop.'" She managed something close to a smile. "So here I am, Josiah, not stopping. That's the whole of my plan. Just don't stop and see where the not stopping takes me." The old man was quiet a while, peeling. "It took you to the one horse on this ranch nobody else can get near," he said finally. "You know that's what they're all whispering about, that black mare." "I know." "You mean to try her?" "I mean to sit with her," Margaret said. "There's a difference. And yes, I do." Josiah shook his head slow, but it wasn't a no. "That animal put Roy's hand out of joint for good and near killed a man from the next spread. Caleb wants her shot." He looked at her steady. "But I'll tell you something, missus, since you told me yours. I watched Boss buy that mare. I stood right at that auction, and the reason he paid what he paid weren't the bloodline. It was the way she stood there trembling with every man in that yard yelling and cracking whips and wouldn't go down, wouldn't ever go down. He saw something in her." Josiah dropped the last potato in the pot. "Same thing I reckon he's starting to see in you." And there was William Hawthorne, who watched. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man who said much, but Margaret felt him watching, and it wasn't the way the others watched, the up and down, the weighing and finding wanting. He watched the way her father used to watch a new horse in the round pen, like he was trying to see what was actually there underneath what everybody assumed. It was the fourth day that she saw what the men had been whispering about with her own eyes. She was crossing the yard with the noon slop bucket when a shout went up from the far corral and men came running, and she set the bucket down and came to, because there is a note in a man's voice when things have gone wrong that you learn to hear and never unlearn. Two of the hands had gotten a rope on the black mare. Del Freeman, a big slab of a man with hands like hams, had climbed the rail with a saddle blanket, meaning to throw it over her and see could he get her used to the weight. And midnight had gone up. She came off the ground with both front feet, and she came down screaming, and the rope burned through Del's grip and took the skin with it, and then she spun quick as a cat for all her size, and her hindquarters caught Del square and flung him into the rails like he was a sack of feed. He hit, and he dropped, and he didn't get up right away, and the mare wheeled in the center of the corral sides, heaving eyes, rolling white, striking at nothing, at everything, at the whole memory of every man who'd ever come at her with a rope. "Get him out! Get him out!" Caleb was already at the gate. Two men grabbed Del under the arms and hauled him under the bottom rail, his face torn open along the cheekbone blood in the dust. And Caleb Turner turned and walked fast toward the tack room, and Margaret knew where a man walked when he walked like that, and what he meant to bring back. "Mr. Turner." She was moving before she decided to. "Mr. Turner, wait. That animal's done Mrs. Collins." He didn't slow. "I warned him. I warned the boss. She's had every chance a horse gets, and she near killed a man just now for trying to be kind to her." "He came at her with a rope and a blanket she couldn't see," Margaret said. "That's not kindness to a horse that's been roped and beat. That's the whole nightmare come again. She wasn't trying to kill him, Mr. Turner. She was trying to live. There's a difference." "Yeah, you keep saying that." Caleb stopped at the tack room door and turned on her, and there was real grief under the hardness, and that surprised her. "You think I want to? I've put down horses my whole life, and I've hated every one. But I've buried men too, missus. Good men on account of a bad horse, and I will not stand here and watch that happen again, just because a woman with a soft heart come off a stagecoach and told me a killer's really only scared." "Then don't watch," Margaret said. "Give me 2 weeks. If I'm wrong, I'll load the rifle myself, and I won't say a word against it. But if I'm right..." "Enough!" William Hawthorne's voice cut across the yard. He'd come from the house at a run, and now he stood between them, and he looked at Del being helped toward the bunkhouse with his face laid open, and he looked at the mare still wheeling and blowing behind the rails, and Margaret watched a terrible weight come down over him. "Boss," Caleb said quietly, "it's time. You know it is." For a long moment, William didn't answer. He looked at the mare. And whatever he saw when he looked at her, it wasn't what Caleb saw. "Not today," he said at last. "William, not today, Caleb." He put a hand on the older man's shoulder, and it was gentle, and it was final. "Get Del to the house, and send a boy for the doctor. And leave the rifle where it lays." He looked at Margaret, then one hard look that said more than the yard full of men could know. And then he walked away toward the wounded man, and Caleb stood there breathing hard, and the mare screamed once more into the noon, and then went still. On the fourth evening, he came and found her at the woodpile splitting kindling in the last of the light, because she'd noticed the box by the stove was low. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Josiah handles the wood. Josiah's got a bad hip and 40 other things to handle." Margaret set another piece up and split it clean. "And I'd rather be tired than idle. Idle's when the thinking gets loud." William was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Your husband." Caleb said 3 weeks. 3 weeks and 2 days. "I'm sorry." "Everybody's sorry," Margaret said, not unkindly, setting up another piece. "Sorry doesn't split wood." She brought the axe down. "But I thank you for it. There's a difference between sorry that wants something back and sorry that just is. Yours is the second kind, I can tell." "How?" "Because you didn't look at me sideways when you said it. People who want your grief to make them feel generous, they always look at you sideways. watching to see if it landed. She set the axe head down and leaned on the handle and looked at him. "You lost somebody." It wasn't a question, and William Hawthorne didn't pretend it was. "My wife," he said. 4 years back, and a son that came too early the same week. He said it flat, the way you say a thing you've had to say enough times that the words have worn smooth. "So, I know the kind of sorry you mean." Margaret didn't say she was sorry. She just told him she knew the difference, and the truest thing she could do was not say the useless one. "That's why you understand horses that flinch," she said instead, softly. He looked at her sharp. "What?" "Nothing." She picked the axe back up. "Just something my father used to say. That grief teaches you the same language fear speaks. That once you've been afraid of the thing that hurt you, you can always spot it in something else." She split the last piece. He said the best horse gentlers he ever knew were all people who'd been hurt bad and hadn't let it turn them mean. William Hawthorne stood there in the near dark for a long moment, and Margaret gathered up the split wood, and just as she turned to carry it in, he said, "There's a mare." She stopped. "Caleb mentioned there was one more thing," she said. "She's the one thing." William put his hands in his pockets and looked toward that separate corral at the far end of the yard, and Margaret understood now that everything about him got quieter when he looked at it. "Her name's Midnight. Black 16 hands, best built animal I ever laid eyes on. I bought her at auction 8 months ago for more money than I had any business spending because I looked at her and I thought, there. That's the one that turns this place around. A stud line off a mare like that, we'd have buyers from 3 territories. And she's put 4 men in the dirt and 1 in a bed for a month," William said. "She's thrown every rider I own. She bit Roy so bad down to the bone he still can't close his left hand right. Caleb wants me to sell her for meat before she kills somebody. Says a mare like that's already ruined and there's no fixing ruined." He looked at Margaret. "And every day I don't decide, I lose money I don't have, and I get closer to proving him right." Margaret set the wood down on the porch step. "Take me to see her," she said. "Now it's dark. I don't need to touch her. I just need to see her." Margaret was already moving. "You can learn near everything you need to know about a horse from watching it think it's alone." They walked to the far corral together, and William brought a lantern but kept it low, and Midnight was a shape of deeper black against the black over in the corner, as far from the gate as she could get. And even in that little light, Margaret could see it. The way the mare stood. The way her head came up the second she caught their scent. Not with the flat-eared fury of a mean horse, with the whites showing round her eyes, and every muscle wound to run of an animal that has learned that people mean pain, and is only waiting to find out what kind this time. "They keep telling you she's dangerous," Margaret said quietly. "She is dangerous. You saw what she did to Dell today." "She's terrified," Margaret said. "Those aren't the same thing either, Mr. Hawthorne. Though I'll grant you they can look it from the outside." She watched the mare a while longer. Somebody hurt this horse. Bad and for a long time, and in a way that taught her the only safe thing to do is strike first. That's not ruined. That's just a wound that learned to bite. And you can't sell that for meat any more than you could have sold me for it the day I stepped off that coach with everybody in town already deciding I was finished. The lantern light shook a little. William had turned to look at her instead of the horse. "Caleb'll never let you near her," he said. "Then don't ask Caleb," Margaret said. "Ask me. I'll do it on my own time before the work and after it. It won't cost you a hand's wages or an hour of daylight. And if I'm wrong, you've lost nothing you weren't already about to lose." She turned from the fence. "But I don't think I'm wrong. I've seen that look before. I saw it in the mirror 3 weeks ago." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the mare breathing hard in the dark corner and the tick of the lantern flame. "The week's not up," William said at last. "Caleb hasn't given his word yet on whether you stay." "Then let this be how I earn it," said Margaret Collins. And William Hawthorne, who had bought an impossible horse because he'd looked at her and seen something worth saving, looked now at an impossible woman and saw the same thing and heard himself say, "Before the work and after it, nobody's to know but you and me. And Mrs. Collins, if that horse so much as pins an ear, you're out of that corral. You hear I've buried enough. I won't bury you over a mare." "You won't," Margaret said. "I promise you that. She's not going to hurt me. You can't know that." "No," Margaret agreed. "But I know I'm not going to give her a reason to. And with a scared thing, that's most of the whole of it." She started the next morning before the sun. She didn't take a rope. She didn't take a whip or a halter or any of the things the men had come at midnight with. She took a bucket of water and a fold of her apron full of oats, and she opened the gate of the far corral and stepped just inside it, and then she stopped and she sat down on an overturned feed crate against the fence, and she did nothing at all. Midnight bolted to the far side and stood trembling watching. Margaret didn't look at her. She'd learned that from her father too, that looking straight at a frightened animal is the language of a predator, and that the kindest thing you can do is give it your side and your patience, and let it decide when it's ready to be curious. So she sat, and she hummed low under her breath, the tune Thomas used to hum over his tack. And after a while, she set the oats down in the dirt a few feet from her, and pushed them out with the toe of her boot. And then she left them, and she went to her morning's work, with the mare still trembling in the corner. When she came back that evening, the oats were gone. She said nothing about it to anyone. She filled the apron again. She sat on the crate. She hummed. Each day, she set the oats a hand's breadth closer to herself than the day before, so close by the fourth day that the mare had to come within reach of her to take them. And each day, the mare came quicker to it, less afraid, until the coming stopped looking like hunger and started looking like something else. Curiosity. The first cousin of trust. She talked to the horse the whole while, low and steady, and it didn't much matter what she said. She told her about Thomas. She told her about the little house and the bank and the long road west. She told her, "Nobody's coming with a rope while I'm sitting here. You've got my word on that, and I don't break my word to horses or to anybody. The rope days are over. You just don't know it yet." And the mare's ears, which had lain flat as boards that first morning, came up by inches day over day, until they turned toward the sound of her voice the way a flower turns to find the sun. Caleb Turner watched it happen. He never said so. But Margaret saw him more than once of a morning standing off at the corner of the barn with his coffee going cold in his hand, watching a woman he'd told to go home unbreak a horse he'd meant to shoot. And the day he moved her off the bramble stretch of fence, and the day he stopped correcting Samuel for helping her. Those were the days that came after his mornings at the corner of the barn. "You're going to make me eat a great many of my words, Mrs. Collins," he told her once gruff passing by. "I'll try to leave you a few to keep your pride on," Margaret said, not looking up from the mare, and old Caleb almost smiled. The ranch hands laughed when they figured out what she was doing, sitting on a crate talking to a killer horse. "She's plumb lost her mind," Roy said. "Talks to it like it's her dead husband." "Leave it be, Roy," Samuel said. $10 says that mare puts her in the dirt inside the week." But Roy Danswell was not a man who could stand to be proved wrong quietly, and the more the mare gentled toward Margaret, the worse it ate at him, until on the sixth evening, he did a thing that near cost everything. Margaret was sitting on her crate in the last of the light humming, and the mare had come to the middle of the corral and stood there watching her with something in her eyes that wasn't fear anymore, or wasn't only fear. And Roy came up to the rail behind Margaret quiet as he could, and he had a length of chain in his hand, and he threw it hard against the top rail so it cracked and rattled like a shot. The mare exploded. She came off her feet and spun, and for one breath she was bearing down on Margaret, with her ears flat, and her whole weight coming, and every man who saw it swore later they watched a woman about to die. But Margaret didn't run. Running is what prey does, and running is what tells a scared thing that its fear was right all along. She stood up off the crate slow, and she turned her side to the mare, and she said, not loud, "Easy, easy now. That wasn't you, and it wasn't me. That was somebody small doing a cruel thing, and we're neither of us going to give him the show he came for." And she kept her eyes soft and down, and she hummed the first low notes of Thomas's tune, and the mare slid to a stop 3 feet from her, with her sides heaving, and stood and shook, and did not strike. And then William Hawthorne had Roy Danswell by the collar. He'd come across that yard faster than anyone had ever seen him move, and he slammed Roy back against the rails and held him there, and William's voice, when it came, was worse for being quiet. "You could have got her killed." "Boss, I was only—" "You threw iron at a spooked horse with a person standing in front of it." William's hand tightened. "You've hated her since the coach because she started with nothing and didn't turn out like you. I've watched it. The whole ranch has watched it, and I've let it ride because a man's entitled to his sourness." He leaned in. "But you brought a chain to a corral to make a widow woman get trampled so you could win a $10 bet and feel bigger than you are. That's the size of you, Roy. That's the whole size of you." He let him go. "Draw your pay. You're done here. You're firing me over—" "I'm firing you over a chain," William said. "Go." And Roy went white-faced and shaking with a fury that would matter more than any of them yet knew, and he stopped at the gate and looked back at Margaret with a hate so plain it turned the evening cold. And then he was gone into the dark toward the bunkhouse and toward. Though none of them could see it, the men in town, who would pay good money to know that Hawthorne Ranch was weak and getting weaker, and that the black mare everybody had written off was suddenly worth a fortune to the woman who'd tamed her. Margaret sat back down on her crate. Her hands were shaking now, though they hadn't when it mattered. The mare took one more step toward her and lowered her great black head, and for the first time let out a long breath that wasn't fear, and Margaret let her own tears come at last quiet, and said, I know, me too." "You all right?" William was at the rail now, his voice gone gentle as fast as it had gone hard. "I'm all right." She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. "You didn't have to fire him over me." "I didn't fire him over you," William said. "I fired him over what kind of place I mean this to be. You just showed me what kind that is." He looked at the mare close now to a woman for the first time in her ruined life, and something in his face eased that Margaret hadn't seen ease before. "My God," he said quietly. "She trusts you." "Not yet," Margaret said, "but she's deciding to, and that's the harder thing. Trusting's easy once you've decided. It's the deciding that near kills you." But the week came and went, and Caleb Turner came to William Hawthorne on the 7th evening, and stood in the office with his hat in his hands, and said the thing it plainly cost him something to say. "She stays," Caleb said. "The Collins woman. She's outworked every hand I've got, and outlasted the ones that hoped she'd quit, and I gave you my word I'd tell you true." He turned his hat in his hands. "I told her this land breaks people stronger than her. I was wrong about which kind of strong matters. Don't make me say it twice." "I won't," William said, and then careful. "She been out to the far corral that you've seen." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I've seen. Whole ranch has seen. I've held my peace on it because it's your ranch and your neck, but I'll say it once plain. That mare is going to hurt her, not because the woman's a fool. She's no fool. But because that animal is broke in the place that don't mend, and no amount of sitting on a crate is going to change what somebody already made her into." He set his hat back on his head. "I've been wrong once this week. I don't expect to be wrong twice." But he was. Because the very next morning, before the light was full up, Margaret Collins sat on her crate and hummed her dead husband's tune, and William Hawthorne stood at the corner of the barn where Caleb used to stand watching because he could no more stay away from that corral of a morning than he could stop the sun from coming, and he watched a thing happen that 8 months and a dozen men and more money than he had could not buy. Midnight, the black mare that no man could touch lifted her head out of the corner, and she took one slow step toward the woman everyone in Red Hollow had already decided was finished. And then another. Margaret didn't move. She didn't reach. She didn't so much as turn her head. She just kept humming low and steady, the way you'd hum to a child that had waked from a nightmare, and the mare came on one careful step, and then the next, until she stopped close enough that Margaret could feel the warm breath of her stir the loose hair at her temple. And there they stayed, the impossible horse and the unwanted woman. both of them trembling with the same terrible weight, the weight of wanting to trust something again after the world had taught them better. Margaret let the tears run down her face without a sound, because she knew that trembling. She knew it in her own bones, in her own grief, in every mile of that long road west. She had stood exactly where the mare was standing, wanting so bad to believe there was one safe thing left in the world, and being so afraid to find out there wasn't. "I know," she whispered so low that even William, 30 feet off with his heart in his throat, couldn't hear the words. "I know, girl. Me too. But look, look. The sun still came up. It came up for both of us." And slow, so slow, Margaret Collins lifted one open hand, palm up, asking nothing, promising everything, and held it steady in the gold light between them, and the black mare lowered her great head and breathed, and did not run. Behind them at the corner of the barn, William Hawthorne took off his hat and held it against his chest, and did not know he'd done it, and could not have said for the life of him whether the thing gone loose and aching in his chest was for the horse at all. The black mare's muzzle came down the last 2 inches on its own. Margaret didn't push. She'd held that open hand steady in the cold gold light for what felt like the length of a life, and she let the mare close the distance herself. Because a gift a scared thing takes is a gift it keeps, and a thing you take from it is just one more theft it'll remember. And midnight touched her palm with the soft of her nose, breathed once hot and quick, and then stood there, letting a human being touch her for the first time in 8 months, without a single tremor running through her hide. "There," Margaret whispered. "There now. That wasn't so hard, was it?" She turned her hand slow and laid it flat against the great black cheek, and the mare leaned into it. Leaned her whole weight of grief into a widow's open hand, the way a body leans when it has finally found the one place in the world it doesn't have to brace. Behind them at the corner of the barn, William Hawthorne made a sound that wasn't a word, and Caleb Turner, who had come out to fetch him and stopped dead 30 feet back, took his hat off too, without knowing he did it, and stood there with 40 years of certainty coming apart in his chest. "I'll be damned," Caleb said, very quiet. "You said she was broke in the place that don't mend," William said, not looking away. "I did." Caleb's voice had gone rough. "I've never in my life been gladder to be a liar." Neither man moved to come closer. They knew better now. They stood and watched a woman they'd both underestimated stand hip to shoulder with the most dangerous animal in the territory, and the animal sighed and dropped its head and dozed. By noon, it was all over the ranch. By supper, it was in town. That was the trouble with a miracle. It didn't stay put. Word ran from the bunkhouse to the mercantile to the saloon, the way fire runs through dry grass. And by the time the sun went down on Hawthorne land, there wasn't a soul in Red Hollow who hadn't heard that the fat widow everybody'd laughed off the stagecoach had gone and gentled the black devil mare that put a man in bed for a month. Some of them didn't believe it. Some of them rode out the next day just to lean on the far fence and see for themselves, and they saw, and they went home quiet. And one of them, sitting in the back of the saloon with his ruined left hand curled around a whiskey he couldn't pay for, listened to every word of it and hated it more with each retelling. "They're calling her a horse whisperer," a man at the bar said. "Say that mare follows her round the corral like a pup." Roy Danswell set his glass down careful. "That mare's worth $3,000 the day somebody can put a saddle on her," said another. "More. There's stud buyers in Cheyenne been asking after Hawthorne's black for months." "Well, Hawthorne can't hardly pay his hands. Everybody knows that. Banks got him by the throat." Roy turned around on his stool. "Who's asking after that mare?" he said. "In Cheyenne. Who?" The men looked at him, at the hand, at the meanness sitting plain on his face, and one of them said the name, because there was no harm in it that he could see. "Fella named Voss. Edward Voss. Buys and sells all over the territory. Deep pockets. Why?" Roy didn't answer. He finished the whiskey he couldn't pay for, and walked out into the dark, and he was smiling for the first time since William Hawthorne had thrown him off the place, because a man with a grudge and a piece of valuable news has got himself something to sell. And Roy Danswell had never in his life passed up a thing he could sell. It took him 2 days on a borrowed horse to reach Cheyenne, and a day of asking to find the man, and when he found him, Edward Voss did not stand up from his chair and did not offer his hand, and looked at Roy's ruined left hand the way you look at a tool that's already served its purpose. "You worked for Hawthorne," Voss said, "till he threw me off for nothing." Roy stayed standing because he hadn't been asked to sit. "I got news you'll want, Mr. Voss. About a black mare." Something changed in the room. Voss set down his glass. "Sit," he said. And Roy sat and he talked and he told it all. The widow who'd come off the coach and gentled the killer mare with nothing but oats and patience. The saddle blanket the animal was letting her lay across its back. The note on the land that came due in the fall, and the bank that was tired of waiting. He told it the way a man tells a thing, when he's finally found somebody who'll pay to hear his hate spoken out loud. And Edward Voss listened without moving, and when Roy got to the part about the mare, gentling his soft hand, tightened on the arm of the chair, until the knuckles went white. "You're certain of this," Voss said, "that the animal has settled, that it lets itself be handled. Follows the fat woman round like a pup. Seen it myself." For a long moment, Voss said nothing at all. He was looking at a spot on the wall that Roy couldn't see, and there was something behind his eyes that made even Roy, who was not a soft man, want to leave the room. "I've been trying to buy that mare back for 8 months. Voss said mostly to himself. "Since the fool at the auction let her go. I'd have paid anything. I couldn't say why without saying the thing I can't say." He came back to himself and looked at Roy, and the smile arrived, and it was worse than no smile at all. "You've done me a service, Mr. Danswell, and I always pay for a service." He counted bills onto the desk, more money than Roy had seen in a year. "There's this. And there'll be more if you're willing to earn it. Because I don't just want to know about the mare." He pushed the money across. "I want to know everything that happens on that ranch when it happens. Who comes? Who goes? What that widow finds. Are we understood?" Roy looked at the money. He thought for just a second about William Hawthorne taking his hat off to a woman about the whole ranch, watching him get thrown off the place, and whatever thin thing might have held a better man back went quiet in him. "We're understood," Roy said, and took the money and did not ask what a man wanted so badly with a horse that he'd pay to have it followed. He should have asked. It would have been the one wise thing he ever did. But Roy Danswell had never once in his life passed up money to ask a question, and he did not start that day. Out at the ranch, Margaret knew none of it. She was too busy with the mare. The touching had opened a door, and she went through it careful an inch at a time. She brought a soft rope the next morning, and let Midnight smell it, and dropped it in the dirt, and picked it up, and dropped it again a dozen times, until a rope was just a thing that lay in the dust and didn't hurt anybody. Then a halter the same way. Then days on a saddle blanket folded small offered flat on her palm like a treat. And the mare's whole body locked up rigid the first time she saw it, because a blanket was the last thing she'd seen before Del Freeman went into the rails. "I know," Margaret said. "I know what the last one meant. This one doesn't mean that. Watch." And she laid the blanket over her own shoulders and stood there wearing it like a shawl, humming, until the terror bled out of the mare by inches. And she came and lipped at the edge of it curious, and the thing that had been a nightmare became just wool. The days ran together after that, each one a small war one. The cinch was the hardest. The first time Margaret drew it up soft under the mare's belly, Midnight humped her back and skittered sideways, and near came out of her own hide, because a cinch was a thing that held you fast so you couldn't run, and a horse that had learned running was the only mercy left could not abide being held. So Margaret loosed it, and drew it up a finger's width, and loosed it, and drew it up again day over day, an inch of trust at a time, telling her the whole while, "You can leave any second you want. That's the difference. Nobody's holding you but you." Until the day came, the mare stood with the cinch snug, and blew out a breath and cocked one hind foot to rest, and Margaret had to turn away so the men wouldn't see her cry. They came to watch some days, not just the hands. Folk from town rode out and leaned on the far rail, the same folk who'd laughed her off the boardwalk her first hour in Red Hollow, and they didn't laugh anymore. One afternoon, the tall woman with the poison-sweet voice came in a wagon and sat and watched a long while. And when Margaret came to the fence for water, the woman wouldn't quite meet her eye. "They said you couldn't be real," the woman said finally. "What they said you did. I came to see, was it a lie? And it ain't a lie." The woman worked the reins in her hands. "I said a cruel thing to you that first day. About your—" She stopped. "It wasn't Christian. I've thought on it." Margaret looked at her a moment. She could have made her carry it. Lord knew the woman had earned an afternoon of squirming. "You came all the way out here to say so," Margaret said instead. "That's more than most would. We'll leave it there." And she went back to the mare, and behind her she heard the woman let out a breath like something set down, and Margaret thought, "That's two of them gentled this month," and near smiled. Caleb took to coming out mornings. He never offered to help. He just stood at the fence with his coffee and watched, and one morning he said, gruff, "My daddy gentled horses like that. Slow. Everybody laughed at him too. Said a horse you didn't break clean wasn't broke at all." He drank his coffee. He had the soundest horses in 3 counties, and they'd have walked into a fire for him. I forgot that. Somewhere along 40 years of doing it the hard way, I plain forgot it. He looked at her. "Thank you for reminding me, Mrs. Collins. It don't come easy to say." "It came out fine," Margaret said, and she smiled at him, and old Caleb Turner ducked his head like a boy and went back to his coffee. William came out mornings too. He told himself it was to check on the mare. It was not to check on the mare. He'd stand at the rail and watch Margaret work, and they'd talk low the way you talk when there's an animal near you that startles easy. And the talking got to be the best part of his day, and then it got to be the part of the day he built the rest around. He learned that she'd read every book her father owned twice over. He learned she could figure a column of sums in her head faster than he could on paper, that she'd kept the books for a whole trading operation before she was 20. He learned that when she laughed, really laughed, she put a hand over her mouth like she'd been taught somewhere along the way that her joy took up too much room, and it made him want to find whoever taught her that and have a word. "You do that with your hand," he said one morning before he'd thought better of it. She stopped. "Do what?" "When you laugh, you cover it up." He looked at the mare instead of at her because it was easier. "You don't have to. Not here. There's nobody on this place worth hiding a laugh from anymore." Margaret went quiet. When she spoke, her voice had gone careful. "My whole life, Mr. Hawthorne, people have been telling me I was too much, too big, too loud, too much of everything a woman's supposed to make small." She kept her eyes on the mare. "You learn to fold yourself up. You learn to take up less room so folks won't be reminded you're there. Thomas—" Her voice caught and steadied. "Thomas used to take my hand down from my mouth when I laughed. Every time. Said he'd married the whole of me, and he'd be hanged if he'd only get to keep the quiet parts." She managed a small smile. "You're the first man since him to notice I was doing it." "He sounds like he was a good man," William said. "He was the best one I ever knew." She looked at him then, and something in her face was open in a way it hadn't been. Right up until lately. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. The mare grazed. The morning warmed. And a thing that had no business growing between a widow 3 months in the ground and a rancher 4 years a widower went right on growing anyway. The way green things do without asking anybody's leave. "You keep the books here?" she asked him one morning out of nothing. The question caught him off guard. "Josiah does the ordering. I do the rest." "Why?" "Because a man who does his own books doesn't stand at a fence looking like the ground's about to open under him unless the books are why." She kept her eyes on the mare. "I'm not prying, Mr. Hawthorne, but I kept ledgers for a living, and I know the look of a man carrying a number he can't make come out. You've had it since I got here." William was quiet a long moment. "The note on this place comes due in the fall," he said finally, low. Principal and interest both. My father borrowed against the land to buy the breeding stock back when there was going to be a railroad spur out this way and everybody was going to be rich. He shook his head. The spur went north. The stock died in the hard winter, and the note kept right on being due. He looked at her. I've been getting by, barely. Selling off pieces, cutting the hand's wages, telling myself next season. But the truth of it is, if I can't put a saddle on that mare and sell her line for real money before the leaves turn, I lose the whole place. My father's place, everything he built. He said it plain, and it cost him. You're the first person I've told. Why me? Because you asked like it was arithmetic, William said, and not like it was a shame. Margaret looked at him, then really looked, and something passed between them that neither one of them named, because naming it would have made it a thing that could be lost, and they'd both lost enough. Then we'll get a saddle on her, Margaret said. And we'll do it right, and we'll do it in time. You hear me? I didn't come all this way to watch you lose your father's land over a horse everybody but us gave up on. We, William said. We, said Margaret Collins, and she went back to the mare before he could see what was on her face. The saddle came in stages over days. First the blanket accepted, then the empty saddle held up for the mare to see, set on the rail, set on the ground, walked around 100 times till it was furniture. Then one still morning, with Caleb and Josiah and young Samuel, all watching from the fence, and not one of them breathing, Margaret lifted the saddle slow onto the black mare's back and set it down soft as a whisper. Midnight's skin shivered. Her head came up. Easy, Margaret breathed. Easy, it's just weight. It's just my hands, nobody's cinching anything. Feel it, that's all. Just feel it. The mare stood, trembling, but she stood, and Samuel let out a breath that turned into a laugh that he choked off, and Josiah wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist and pretended it was dust, and Caleb Turner said to nobody, "In 30 years, I never and couldn't finish it." And that was the morning the buggy came up the road. It was a fine buggy, too fine for Red Hollow, matched bays, and lacquered black, and a driver up front in a good coat, and the man who stepped down from it wore a suit that had never seen a day's work, and a smile that had. He was maybe 50 silver at the temples, soft in the belly, hard in the eyes, and he looked at the whole ranch the way a man looks at a thing he's already deciding the price of. "Hawthorne Ranch," he said like he was tasting it. "And which of you gentlemen is the owner? I've got business worth your while." William came off the fence. "That's me, William Hawthorne. And you are Edward Voss." The man put out a soft hand. "I buy horses, Mr. Hawthorne. Good ones. Rare ones. And I have heard all the way in Cheyenne that you've got the rarest one in the territory, sitting in a corral out here going to waste." His eyes slid past William, past the men, and landed on the black mare standing saddled and trembling, with a fat woman at her head, and something moved in his face when he saw her. Something quick and covered fast, and Margaret caught it and didn't know yet what it meant, and would spend the next weeks wishing she'd trusted the cold that ran through her the moment she saw it. Because Edward Voss looked at midnight the way a man looks at a dog that slipped its chain. Not with wonder. With something older and uglier that lived under the smile. "That's the mare," Voss said softly. "That's her." "She's not for sale," William said. Voss laughed easy, like William had told a joke. "Now, son, everything's for sale. It's only ever a question of the number. I'll give you 1,500 for her right now, cash out of that bag on my buggy. You'll never make that off a saddle horse, and we both know a mare like that's got no other use." "She's not for sale," William said again. The smile stayed on Voss's mouth, but it went out of his eyes. 2,000. "Mr. Voss." William didn't raise his voice. "I've told you twice. I don't much care to say it a third time. She's not for sale at any number you've got in that bag." Voss's gaze moved off William, then slow, and found Margaret at the mare's head, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at the ranch. Weighing. Pricing. "You'll be the widow," he said. "The horse gentler they're all talking of." He came a step closer, and Midnight's head snapped up, and her whole body went rigid, and Voss watched that happen with a small private satisfaction that turned Margaret's stomach. "You've done fine work, missus. You've made a worthless animal worth something again." His voice dropped just for her. But you want to be careful with a beast like that. They turn. You think you've won their trust, and then one day something reminds them of the thing they can't forget, and they turn on the very hand that fed them. I'd hate to see it happen to a woman who'd worked so hard. Is that a warning about the horse, Mr. Voss? Margaret said, quiet and even her hand flat on the trembling black neck. Or about yourself? The yard went still. Voss's smile froze half an inch. I don't believe I take your meaning. No, said Margaret. You don't. Yet. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the price of a horse, and Voss was the first to look away. Then he looked at the ranch again, slow at the sagging barn, at the fences that needed mending, at the too few hands, and the smile turned into something worse than a smile. You know, he said, pleasant as poison. I've done a great deal of business in this territory, Mr. Hawthorne. Banks especially. Banks and me, we understand each other. A man in the horse trade needs to know which spreads are sound and which ones are... He let it hang. Which ones are living on borrowed time and a banker's patience. He put his soft hand back in his pocket. I'd think hard about the number if I were you. Because a note called early can turn $2,000 cash into the difference between selling me a horse and losing everything you've got. And notes get called for all sorts of reasons. A word here, a word there. He tipped his hat, mocking. You take your time. I'm a patient man. I've waited a long while for that particular mare. I can wait a little longer. He climbed back in his buggy, and the matched bays took him back down the road, and every man on that ranch stood dead still until the dust settled, and then Caleb said what all of them were thinking. He knows about the note. He knows about the note, William said. His jaw was tight. Which means somebody told him. Somebody who's been on this place. Somebody who knew. And Margaret, standing at the mare's head with her hand flat on the black neck, felt the cold run through her again, and this time she knew exactly whose face it was. Roy, she said. William turned. He went to town swearing he'd make you pay, Margaret said. And a man like Voss pays for news. It's the only thing Roy Danswell had left to sell. She looked down the empty road where the buggy had gone. But that's not the part that's got the hair up on my neck, Mr. Hawthorne. Did you see how he looked at her at midnight? I saw a man look at a horse he wanted. No. Margaret shook her head slow. I've watched 1,000 men look at horses they wanted. That's greed, and greed looks at the animal like it's money. She turned back to the mare, who had gone rigid again, whose eyes had rolled white the whole time Voss stood in the yard, who was pressing her great head hard into Margaret's chest now, like a child hiding its face. That's not how he looked at her. And it's not how she looked at him. Her voice dropped. She knew him, William. Look at her. She's shaking down to the ground. She's not scared of a stranger. She's scared of him. Margaret pressed her cheek against the trembling black neck. That man's been near this horse before, and whatever he did to her, she has not forgot 1 second of it. For a moment nobody said anything. The wind moved through the yard. You're saying Voss is the one, Caleb said slowly. The one that ruined her, before the auction. I'm saying she knows his face and his voice and the smell of him, and every one of them turned her back into the animal you wanted to shoot. Margaret straightened. Her eyes had gone harder than any of them had seen them. And I'm saying a man doesn't come 2 days out from Cheyenne and wave $2,000 at a struggling rancher for a mare he could buy sound anywhere, unless there's a reason he needs this one. This exact one. And a man doesn't go to that trouble for a horse he loves. He goes to that trouble for a horse that knows something about him he can't afford anybody else to see. A horse can't testify, Mrs. Collins, Caleb said, but he said it uneasy, like he already half believed her. No, Margaret agreed. But a horse can be proof of what a man is, of what he does behind a barn where he thinks nobody's counting. She looked at William. You said your father borrowed against this land for breeding stock. Where'd he buy it? Who from? William went still. Cheyenne, he said slowly. Most of it, through a broker. I've got the papers. My father kept every paper he ever signed. Then that's where we start, Margaret said. In your father's papers. Because I'd wager my last dollar that if we go looking, Edward Voss's name is in this ranch's history a good deal further back than today. And a man who's already got his hooks in your past, she looked down the road again, is not a man who came here for a horse. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a lamp turned low and a box of William's father's papers open in front of her, and she read the way she'd once kept books for a living, fast and careful and missing nothing. And William sat across from her because he could not have slept either. And Josiah brought coffee twice and didn't ask. It was near 2 a.m. when Margaret went still with a paper in her hand. William, her voice had changed. This bill of sale, the breeding stock your father bought the year he took the note. Read me the broker's name. He took it and turned it to the lamp and read it, and his face changed too. Sold on behalf of E. Voss Agent, he read. Cheyenne Territory. He looked up. He sold my father the stock that died, the stock that put the note on this land in the first place. The stock that died, Margaret repeated softly, in a winter that killed everybody's animals, but somehow ruined only the men who'd bought from the same broker. She set the paper aside and kept reading faster now, her finger running the columns. Keep going. If he did it once, there's more. Men like that don't have one scheme. They have a way of doing business, and they do it over and over because it works. They found the second thing an hour later. It was a letter buried at the bottom of the box in a hand that shook the way an old man's hand shakes William's father's hand in the last year of his life. It was addressed to a lawyer in Cheyenne, and it had never been sent, and Margaret read it out loud low in the lamplight. I write to report my suspicion that I was deliberately sold diseased stock. She read by the agent Edward Voss, who I now believe has done the same to 3 other spreads along this valley, all of whom carry notes he has since arranged to purchase from the bank. I believe the man means to ruin us slow and buy our land cheap out of the wreck. I have no proof a court would hear, but I set this down so that if anything should happen to me, my son will know he was not simply unlucky. He was robbed. The kitchen was dead quiet. Somewhere out in the dark, the mare stamped once and went still. He knew, William said. His voice had gone strange. My father knew what Voss did to him, and he never told me. He let me think it was the winter. He let me think it was bad luck. He put his face in his hands. 20 years I've hated myself for not saving this place when the truth is a man set out to take it before I was even grown. He didn't tell you because he had no proof, and no proof means no fight, and he didn't want to hand you a war you couldn't win. Margaret laid her hand over his, there on the table, and neither of them pulled away. But he set it down anyway, because some part of him believed the proof would come someday. And William... She turned his hand over and held it. The proof is standing in that corral right now. Voss ruined your father with paper, and he thinks paper's the only kind of proof there is. He forgot the one witness he couldn't buy or bury or burn. He forgot the horse. William lifted his head. That's why he needs her gone, Margaret said. Not because a mare can talk, because a mare that shies from one man and no other in front of a town full of people is a question. And a question is how the truth starts. He knows it. He's known it since the auction let her slip. She stood up from the table, and the lamp threw her shadow tall against the wall, and her voice when it came was quiet and certain and cold as the well. He is going to come for that horse, William, soon. And when he does, he'll have the bank and the law and every dollar in the territory on his side, and we'll have a widow, a ruined rancher, an old cook, a boy and a black mare that flinches. She looked toward the dark window. Which, near as I can figure, is exactly the kind of odds nobody in this town ever gave me, right up until the morning I proved every last one of them wrong. She was as good as her word. She always was. The first ride came 4 mornings later, and nobody planned it, which was the only way it could have happened. Margaret had the saddle cinched and had leaned across the mare's back 100 times belly down, letting midnight feel her weight and learn it wasn't a thing to fear. And on that 4th morning, with the light just coming gray over the yard, and only Caleb and Josiah at the fence, Margaret set her boot in the stirrup, looked the mare in the eye, and said, I'm going to sit up now. If you tell me no, I'll get down. But I don't think you're going to tell me no." And she swung up. The mare froze. Every muscle in her stood locked. And for one long, terrible breath, the whole 8 months of her ruin hung in the balance. Every rope and whip and cruel hand she'd ever known crowding up behind her eyes at once. "I'm still here," Margaret said soft, not touching the reins, just sitting, just breathing. "I didn't take a thing from you. I'm just up here with you same as I've been down there. Nothing's changed but the height." The mare's ear flicked back toward the voice. She held there trembling at the very edge of the thing, and Margaret didn't move a muscle, didn't so much as tighten her legs, just let the seconds run out slow, and let the horse learn that this time up on her back, still nothing came. No whip, no rope, no cruelty. Only the same steady voice that had never once lied to her. And midnight let the breath go. She took one step, and another. And then the black mare that no man in the territory could sit walked a slow, easy circle around the corral with a widow on her back, and Caleb Turner grabbed the top rail with both hands and hung on like the ground had tilted. And Josiah said the Lord's name in a way that was pure prayer, and Margaret Collins rode a mile of quiet loops around that corral with tears running clean down her face, and never once made a sound to spoil it. "Would you look at that?" Caleb kept saying to nobody over and over. "Would you just look at that?" When she finally stepped down, her legs near buckled, and she pressed her forehead to the mare's neck and stood there a long moment before she could speak. "Somebody go wake William," she said thick. "He's got a horse to sell now. He's got his whole life to save." But saving it turned out to be a race, and the other man had a head start she didn't know about. The banker came 3 days after the first ride. His name was Harlan Crane, and he ran the only bank in Red Hollow, and he came out in a black coat on a fat gray gelding with 2 men behind him who weren't there to talk numbers. He didn't get down. He sat his horse in the yard and looked at William Hawthorne over a folded paper and said the thing he'd ridden out to say. "The note's been called William, paid in full 30 days, or the land's forfeit to satisfy the debt." He held the paper out. "I'm sorry, this ain't how I wanted it." William took the paper and read it, and his jaw went tight. "The note's not due till fall, Harlan. It says so on the paper I signed. There's a clause. Section 4. Bank reserves the right to call the note at its discretion should the security be deemed at risk." Crane wouldn't quite meet his eye. "It's deemed at risk. By who?" Crane didn't answer that. He looked at the folded paper in his own hands like it had gotten heavy. Margaret had come up quiet, wiping her hands on her apron, and she stepped in beside William and looked up at the banker with a steadiness that made the man shift in his saddle. "By Edward Voss," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's who deemed it. You sold him the note, Mr. Crane, or you're about to, and the 30 days is a courtesy, so it looks legal when he takes the land." Crane's face went the color of ash. "Now I don't know what you—" "You do know," Margaret said. "You know exactly. A man rode in from Cheyenne last week and put a number in front of you that made your whole year. And all he wanted for it was for you to squeeze a struggling neighbor off his father's land a few months early. And you're going to sit there and tell yourself it was just business, and you're going to ride home and sleep fine because that's the kind of man it turns out you are." She let that sit on him. "I kept books for a trading house half my life, Mr. Crane. I know a called note dressed up in a clause when I read one, and I know a coward when he can't meet a widow's eye." The 2 men behind Crane shifted. One of them almost smiled. Crane gathered his reins. 30 days, he said, and his voice had lost its ground. "That's the law. That's all I came to say." And he turned his horse and rode fast like a man riding away from something he could still hear. William stood looking at the paper. 30 days, he said. "It'd take $3,000 to clear it. I don't have 300. He looked up, and there was a terrible calm on him, the calm of a man watching the last of a thing go. "There's exactly one way to raise $3,000 in 30 days, Margaret, and you already know what it is." She did. She'd known it the second Crane said the number. "Sell the mare," she said. "Sell the mare," William echoed. And the only man in the territory with $3,000 cash and a burning want for that exact horse is the same man who called the note to force the sale. He laughed, and it had no humor in it at all. He's got me coming and going. If I keep her, I lose the land. If I sell her to save the land, I hand him the one witness to what he did to my father, and he buries her, and buries the truth with her, and wins clean. He crushed the paper in his fist. That's the trap. That's been the trap the whole time. There was never a way out of it. He built it 20 years ago, and I just now walked all the way into the middle of it. No, Margaret said. Margaret, no, there's a third thing. She took the crushed paper out of his hand and smoothed it flat against her palm, thinking the way she used to think over a column that wouldn't balance until she found the one entry somebody hoped she'd miss. He's built the whole trap on nobody knowing what he is. The note, the clause, the price, all of it only works if the town of Red Hollow believes Edward Voss is an honest horse buyer helping a poor rancher out of a hole. She looked up, and something had come into her face, something the men would talk about for years after. So we don't sell him the horse, William. We show the town the horse. We put Edward Voss and that mare in the same place in front of everybody, and we let them see with their own eyes what she does when he comes near. And then we tell them why. A horse shying isn't a proof, Margaret. Crane said it himself. No court. It isn't proof for the court, Margaret said. It's proof for a town. And a town is who a man like Voss has to live in front of. He can beat a court. He's got money enough to beat any court in the territory. But he can't beat 200 people watching a horse he swore he'd never seen fall to pieces at the sound of his voice. She pressed the paper into William's chest. You want to save your father's land? Then we don't fight Voss where he's strong. We fight him where he's naked. We make him do the one thing his kind can never do. We make him stand in the light. William looked at her a long moment. How? He said. How do we get him to stand in front of the whole town next to that horse? And Margaret smiled slow, and it was not a kind smile. We invite him, she said. We announce we're selling the mare. Public. An exhibition and a sale right in the middle of Red Hollow buyers. Welcome, come see the impossible horse the widow tamed. Voss can't stay away. He's wanted her back for 8 months. He'll come with his $3,000, sure the whole thing's a formality, sure he's finally won. She stepped back. And we'll be waiting. They put the word out that afternoon. Samuel wrote it to town, and Josiah wrote it to the neighboring spreads, and by nightfall, all of Red Hollow knew that in 1 week's time on the Saturday, the widow of Hawthorne Ranch would ride the black mare no man could sit right down the main street and sell her to the highest bidder. And the word ran, as they'd known it would, all the way to Cheyenne, and to a man in a good suit who read it with a still face, and then smiled, and told his driver to ready the buggy. What they did not know was that Voss learned the rest of it too. Not just the sale. The plan behind the sale. Roy Danswell had kept his end of the ugly bargain. He'd stayed close to Red Hollow drinking Voss's money, and he had ears in the saloon, and a cousin who hauled feed to the Hawthorne place, and it took him no time at all to put together that the widow wasn't holding a plain sale. She was holding a trap. She was going to walk that mare up to Voss in front of the whole town and let the horse do her talking, and she had papers besides. Roy sent it all to Cheyenne by the next rider, and when the letter reached him, Edward Voss did not rage. He sat very still, and then he laughed the way a man laughs when someone has handed him the shape of the fight before it starts. Because a trap you can see coming is not a trap. It is an opportunity. And Voss rode for the bank in Red Hollow 2 days early and put a stack of money in front of Harlan Crane that made the whole scheme worth it twice over, and bought the note outright, so that whatever the widow did with her horse and her papers and her fine speech, he would already own the ground she made it on. Roy took the last of Voss's money for that letter, and it should have felt like a victory, and it didn't. Because his cousin had told him a thing he couldn't shake, that the widow had ridden the black mare into the yard, easy as breathing. That the horse near everybody had wanted shot was sound and gentle, and following a fat woman around like it loved her, and something in Roy that he'd thought long dead turned over in its grave. He'd bet $10 she'd be trampled. He'd thrown a chain at her to make it true. And she'd stood there and gentled the thing anyway, and never once come at him the way he'd have come at her. He put Voss's money in his boot, and he didn't spend it, and he told himself he didn't know why. The week was the longest of Margaret's life. She rode the mare every morning and every evening in the open, now past things that startled, and things that banged, teaching midnight that the world was wide and full of noise, and none of it had to be a threat. And she watched the mare grow into something none of them had believed she could be, proud and easy and sound a horse that had decided to trust the world one more time on the strength of a single woman's word. On the third day, a hay wagon lost a wheel, not 30 feet off, a crash and a clatter and men hollering, and the mare came up off the ground with fear, and for a heartbeat Margaret was back in the yard the day Roy threw the chain. But she didn't grab the reins. She laid her hand flat on the black neck, and she said low, "I'm here. I'm here. I've got you. That noise can't touch us." And the mare came down onto all 4 feet and stood blowing hard, and then dropped her head and let the fear run out of her. And Margaret understood, sitting there, with her heart going like a drum, that she had her answer to the one question that had kept her up nights. The mare would hold. Under noise, under fear, under the worst the world could throw, if Margaret was on her back with a steady hand, the mare would hold. She would need that to be true. She just didn't yet know how much. And every night Margaret lay awake and turned the plan over and looked for the crack in it, and every night she found the same crack and could not close it. She found William at the corral the night before, and she told him the crack. "If she panics," Margaret said, "in front of everyone. If Voss comes near and she comes apart the way she did in the yard, and I'm on her back in the middle of a crowd." She looked at the dark shape of the mare. "I'm asking her to stand in front of the very thing that ruined her. I spent weeks teaching her the world was safe, and now I'm going to walk her right up to the one man who taught her it wasn't, and pray she trusts me more than she fears him." Her voice dropped. "If she doesn't, William, somebody gets hurt. Maybe me. Maybe a child in that crowd. And it'll be my doing because I asked a wounded thing to be brave for me." William was quiet a while. "You're not asking her to be brave for you," he said finally. "You're asking her to trust you. And that's the one thing she's already decided to do." He turned to her in the dark. "Margaret." That horse walked across a corral toward the first hand in her whole life that never lied to her. "You didn't teach her the world was safe. You taught her that you were. There's a difference, and she knows it even if you don't." He was standing very close now. "She'll stand for you, because you'll be right there with her, same as you've been the whole way. Nothing changed but the height." Margaret looked up at him, and something that had been growing quiet for weeks came up between them all at once, and neither of them stepped back from it. "When this is over," William said low, "whatever way it goes, win or lose the land, there's a thing I've been wanting to say to you, and I've been telling myself to wait for the right time, and I'm done waiting on right times. They don't come. You just have to." "Then don't wait," Margaret said. "I love you," William Hawthorne said. "I have since about the morning you split my kindling because you couldn't stand to be idle. I know it soon. I know we're both still carrying folks we buried. But I'm not going to stand in front of that whole town on Saturday and maybe lose everything without you knowing that whatever happens to this land, the best thing that ever came up that road to me was you." Margaret's eyes filled. She'd told herself she was done with all that. She'd nailed her heart down tight the day she stepped off the coach, and here it was anyway, pulling loose, aching alive. "I came here with a suitcase and a letter," she said, unsteady, "believing my whole life was already behind me, that the best part was in the ground outside Cheyenne, and all I had left was the not stopping." She put her hand flat on his chest. "And you handed me a place to stand and a horse to save, and a reason to laugh out loud with both hands down where everybody could see it." A tear went down her cheek, and she let it. "I love you too, William. God help me, 3 months a widow, and I love you. Now, let's go save your land, because I'll be hanged if I found all this just to lose it to a man in a good suit." That last night, the hands wouldn't go to their bunks. Caleb found the two of them at the corral and stood there working the brim of his hat, and behind him came Josiah and young Samuel, and two of the other men who'd once bet she'd be gone by Thursday, and they arranged themselves along the fence like they'd come to a meeting. "We had a talk as hands," Caleb said gruff. "We know what tomorrow is. We know that Voss has got money and law, and Lord knows what else, and all Boss has got is a horse and a widow, and a busted-down crew that ain't been paid full wages in a year." He cleared his throat, and it cost him. "So we voted, and we're standing with you, all of us, in that street tomorrow, right at the front where the whole town can see whose side we're on. Don't matter how it goes. A man ought to be able to say who he stood next to when it mattered." He jammed his hat back on. "That's all. That's all I come to say." Margaret looked at the row of them along the fence, these men who'd laughed her off the place her first hour, and her throat closed up. "When I stepped off that coach," she said, "not one of you would have crossed the street for me." "No, ma'am," Samuel said quietly. "We surely wouldn't have. And we're ashamed of it. That's why we're crossing it now." Saturday came bright and cruel. They came from everywhere. Red Hollow had never seen a crowd like it. Every rancher and hand and shopkeep and child for 20 miles pressed along the main street because a black mare no man could ride and a widow who'd tamed her was the kind of story a hard country doesn't get but once. Harlan Crane was there in his black coat, pale keeping to the edge. And at the far end of the street, stepping down from a lacquered buggy with a leather bag heavy on his arm, was Edward Voss, smiling the smile of a man who has already spent the money in his head. Margaret rode Midnight in from the ranch road at a slow walk, and the crowd went quiet the way crowds do when they see a thing they'll tell their grandchildren about. The black mare came down the middle of that street, proud as a queen, ears forward, easy under the widow's hands, and there was not a soul in Red Hollow who'd said she could be sat who did not eat those words in that moment. She had them. That was the thing Margaret felt as she rode in. She had every eye in that town, and she had them on her side, and she had exactly the 15 minutes it would take to lose them, or win them for good. "Folks," she called out, and her voice carried clear down the street. "You all know why you came. You came because they told you this horse couldn't be ridden. They told you the same about a good many things I expect. They told me I couldn't work a ranch. They told this town a called note was just business." She let that land and saw Crane flinch. "Well, here's the horse, and in a minute I'll sell her fair and open to whoever's got the money and the right to her. But first I mean to show you something, because there's a man here today who wants this mare bad enough to have moved heaven and earth to get her cheap. And I think you all ought to see how the two of them feel about each other before any money changes hands." The smile came off Edward Voss's face. "Mr. Voss," Margaret called, gentle as Sunday. "You've come a long way for this horse. Come on up then. Come have your look at her close. I'm sure a fine judge of horseflesh like yourself will want to check her over before he bids." She smiled down at him. "Don't be shy. She won't bite. Will she?" The crowd turned to look at him. 200 faces. And Edward Voss, who could beat any court in the territory, who had ruined 4 spreads with paper and never once been caught, stood in the middle of the main street of Red Hollow, with nowhere to hide and no way to say no, without every soul there wondering why. He had walked into the one trap money couldn't buy him out of, because the only way out was to admit he was afraid to stand next to a horse he'd sworn he'd never seen. "This is a circus," Voss said, and his voice wasn't quite steady. "I came to bid on an animal, not to play games with a—" "With a what, Mr. Voss?" a voice called from the crowd. It was one of the ranchers, a lean old man named Ephraim Doyle, whose own spread sat 2 valleys over. "Go on and finish it. With a widow, a fat one. We heard how this town talked to her the day she come in, and then we watched her do a thing not one man here could." He spat in the dust. "I'd have my look at the horse was I you. Seems the only one afraid of that mare is the man who claims he never met her." A murmur went through the street, and it wasn't with Voss. "Then bid," Margaret said into that murmur. "Right after you come, have your look. Everybody looks at a horse before they buy it, Mr. Voss. It'd be strange not to. Folks might wonder why a man would drop $3,000 on an animal he was afraid to walk up to. There was no way out. He knew it. She watched him know it. Edward Voss set his jaw and started up the street toward the Mare, one slow step at a time, and Margaret sat very still and laid her hand flat and steady on the black neck and whispered so low that only the Mare could hear it. I know it's him. I know what he did. He can't touch you. Not ever again. I'm right here, and I am not going anywhere, and all I need you to do is show them. Show them the truth, girl. That's all. Just be the truth out loud. Voss came within 20 feet. The Mare's head came up, 15 feet, 10, and the whole town watched the proud, easy horse that had walked down their street like a queen begin to change the ears, pinning back the eyes, rolling white. The great body trembling every muscle in her, winding up not with meanness, but with a pure animal terror that no man could fake, and no man could mistake a horse coming apart at the sight of one particular face out of 200. Whoa! Voss said, stopping too loud, his hands coming up. Whoa, now easy! And at the sound of his voice, close and low and commanding, the way it must have sounded 1,000 cruel times in a dark barn. Midnight screamed and reared, and the crowd gasped and fell back, and Margaret Collins sat that rearing horse like she'd been born on it, one hand on the neck. Her voice never rising, and brought her down and held her shaking, sweating, but held. And in the silence, after Margaret looked down the length of that street at Edward Voss, and she said quiet, so quiet that every straining soul had to hold its breath to hear, "She knows you, Mr. Voss." Nobody moved. There's not another man, woman, or child in this street she'd so much as flick an ear at. Margaret went on. Watch. She turned the trembling mare and walked her straight at Harlan Crane at the shopkeep at a knot of ranchers right up close, and the mare passed among them, calm as milk, let a child reach up and touch her nose. Then Margaret turned her back toward Voss, and the terror seized the animal all over again, whites showing, and Margaret held her and let the whole town see the difference with their own eyes. She'll stand for a stranger. She'll stand for a child. She comes apart for exactly one man in the territory. Now why do you all suppose that is? That horse is mad, Voss said, but his voice cracked on it. That's a dangerous, ruined animal, and this woman's put on a show to run the price up. I've got the papers, Edward. Margaret's voice went hard as a nail. Bills of sale in your own agent's name. A letter in a dead man's hand, naming exactly what you did to this valley and how. I've got 4 ruined spreads and 4 called notes, and 1 broker's signature tying every one of them together. She held the mare steady and never looked away from him. You didn't come here to buy a horse. You came here to bury the last thing left alive that knew what you were. And she just stood up in the middle of Main Street and told the whole town anyway. The crowd had begun to murmur low and dangerous, the sound a town makes when it starts to turn. Ranchers were looking at Voss now the way they'd once looked at Margaret, and worse. Somebody said Voss's name like a curse. Harlan Crane had gone the color of paper and was edging his gray horse back toward the alley. And Margaret felt it, the thing tipping her way, the 15 minutes spending out exactly as she'd prayed they would, the town turning the truth out loud at last. And for one bright breath, she believed they had won. Then Edward Voss began to laugh. It started low, and it climbed, and it was the laugh of a man who has just remembered the card up his sleeve, and it stopped the murmur cold. He wiped his eyes. He looked up at Margaret on the horse, and the fear was gone out of his face, and something far worse had taken its place. That's a fine speech, Mrs., Voss said. A fine, fine speech. Papers and letters and a nervous horse. You've near got them believing you. He turned in a slow circle, addressing the whole street now, his voice ringing out easy and certain. So let me tell you good people something, and then you can decide who to believe. This morning before I rode out here, I settled a piece of business with your Mr. Crane. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper of his own and held it up high for all of them to see. I bought the note on Hawthorne Ranch. The whole debt. It's mine now, every dollar of it, legal and filed and witnessed. He smiled up at Margaret, and it was the smile of a man laying down a winning hand. So it doesn't much matter what that horse thinks of me. It doesn't matter what's in your dead man's letters. Because as of this morning, I don't need to buy the mare from William Hawthorne." He let it fall on them, slow, savoring it. "I own the ground she's standing on. I own the barn and the corral and the house and every last acre. And I am calling the debt right now in front of all of you, as is my lawful right. $3,000 or I take the land." The street went dead silent. "You've got till sundown," Edward Voss said, folding the paper back into his coat. "Bring me $3,000 by dark William Hawthorne, or come Sunday morning I'll have the marshal put you and your widow and your witness of a horse off my property for good." He tipped his hat, and the smile never wavered. "Enjoy your show, folks. It's the last one that'll ever happen on Hawthorne land." He turned and walked back to his buggy, unhurried. A man who had already won and knew it, and the crowd parted to let him pass. And not one soul in it could think of a thing to say, because he was right, and they all knew he was right. The papers didn't matter. The horse didn't matter. The town had turned against him, and it changed nothing, because a man who owns the ground you stand on does not need you to like him. And Margaret Collins sat the black mare in the middle of that silent street, with the whole town watching the papers useless in her saddlebag, the truth spoken and heard and somehow impossibly not enough. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach with a suitcase and a letter and a heart nailed shut, she did not know what she was going to do. She sat there a long moment, and the town waited to see her break. She did not break, because breaking was a thing Margaret Collins had done already months ago in a rented house outside Cheyenne with a dead man's letter in her hand, and she had learned the one true thing there is to learn from it, which is that you get up after. You always get up after. So she gathered the reins, and she sat that black mare tall in the middle of the silent street, and when she spoke her voice was steady enough to carry to the far end of it. "Marshal Boone," she called. "You've heard all this. You've seen the horse. Is there anything at all you can do?" And the crowd stirred, because most of them hadn't marked the lean gray man sitting his horse, quiet at the edge of the gathering, a tin star dull on his coat, who had ridden in that morning and said nothing to anybody. Deputy U.S. Marshal Amos Boone. Margaret had sent for him a week ago, the same day she'd sent word to Voss. She had never meant to fight this man with a horse and a speech alone. Boone walked his horse forward slow. "I heard it, ma'am." His voice was dry as creek gravel. "And I'll tell you plain, because you strike me as a woman wants it plain. What that horse did just now would move me. It wouldn't move a court." He looked at Voss. "And a man buying a note off a bank is legal as Sunday. If Mr. Voss holds the paper, and the paper's got a clause, then come sundown the law's on his side, and I'd be the one enforcing it." He shifted in the saddle. "I don't like it, but I don't get to like or not like. I get to follow the law. And right now the law says the note is his." "There," Voss said, and the smile came back full. "You heard the marshal. Sundown." And he climbed into his buggy and drove off toward the road to wait out the hours, certain, now entirely certain, that he had won. For a moment, nobody moved. And then, Josiah of all people, old bent Josiah, stepped out into the street and pulled a knotted rag from his pocket and untied it with shaking fingers and held up what was inside. $11, he said loud to the whole town. "It's every cent I got in this world. It's burial money. I've been saving it 40 years so I wouldn't be a burden when I go." He set it down on the boardwalk step. "I'd sooner be buried in a pauper's hole than watch that man take this family's land. Who's next?" And it started. It shouldn't have worked, and everybody knew it shouldn't. $3,000 in a town that poor, but they came anyway. Samuel emptied his pockets. The shopkeep opened his till and carried the whole drawer out into the street. The tall woman who'd mocked Margaret from the boardwalk came and laid down a wedding ring without a word. Ranchers who'd ridden in to watch a spectacle dug out folded bills and coins gone green with age, and a boy put down a nickel, and an old widow put down two, and the pile on the boardwalk step grew, while William stood there with his hat off and his throat working, unable to say a thing. Margaret got down and counted it, because counting was the one thing she'd always been able to do when her heart was too full for anything else. Her hands moved fast and sure over the coins and bills, and the whole town waited, and when she looked up, her eyes were wet. $431, she said, and a wedding ring. It sat in the street between them all, that love, and it was not enough, and everybody knew it wasn't, and the knowing was worse than if they'd never tried. It's the most beautiful pile of money I ever saw in my life, Margaret said, her voice unsteady. And it wouldn't buy back a tenth of this land. She looked around at them, at all of them. But I thank you, every one of you. Because a month ago, not a soul here would have laid down a nickel for us, and today you emptied your burial rags into the street. She wiped her eyes hard. So put it back in your pockets, all of you. We're not going to beat that man with money. We were never going to beat him with money. Her jaw set. We're going to beat him with the truth, and the truth doesn't cost $1. It only ever costs the nerve to say it out loud. The crowd began to break apart, low and unhappy, the way people leave a thing they couldn't fix. And that was when Ephraim Doyle stepped out into the street. "Hold on," Doyle said. "Everybody just hold on a minute." He was looking at William, but his voice was for all of them. "That man said something just now in front of all of us that I can't get out of my head. He said he'd bought notes before, that he owned spreads, that ruining a rancher and buying him out cheap was just how he did business." Doyle's weathered face had gone hard. 14 years ago, I bought breeding stock through a Cheyenne broker, and it died in a bad winter, and I took a note to cover it, and I damn near lost my place. I always figured I was just unlucky." He looked at William. "You said your daddy bought through a broker too. Same story, same winter. What was the broker's name on your daddy's paper, son?" "Voss," William said. "Sold on behalf of E. Voss agent." The street went very still. "Mine said the same," said a voice from the crowd. A rancher named Hollis from up the North Fork pushing forward now. "I burned the paper, but I'd know that name in my sleep." "And mine." A third man, old Pettigrew, who ran sheep on the flats. "E. Voss, I lost half my land to a note off diseased stock. Thought it was God's own bad luck. 14 years I thought that." Margaret sat the mare and felt the whole thing turning under her, like the earth itself. 4 spreads, the father's letter had said. 4 families ruined slow, by the same man with the same scheme over 14 years, each one believing he was simply unlucky. Each one too ashamed to speak of it, until a widow put a horse and a bad man in the same street and made him brag out loud. "Marshal Boone," Margaret said, and her voice rang now. "You said 1 horse and 1 speech wouldn't move a court. What about 4 families? What about the same broker's name on 4 ruined men's papers and a pattern of diseased stock and called notes, 14 years long, and a letter set down by a dying man, naming the whole of it before he passed?" She turned in the saddle. "That's not a spooked horse, Marshal. That's a scheme. And a foreclosure a man wins by running a scheme isn't legal as Sunday. It's fraud. And I don't believe you get to enforce a fraud, even if you'd like to follow the law." Boone was quiet a long moment. Something had waked up behind his tired eyes. "No, ma'am," he said slowly. "I don't believe I do." He looked around the street at the men stepping forward, one and then another. "But suspecting a scheme and proving one are 2 different animals. Papers can be explained away. Bad winters happen. I'd need more than a pattern. I'd need a man's own hand. I'd need proof he did the thing on purpose, that he set out to ruin folks, and knew he was doing it." He looked at Margaret, almost gentle. "You got that, ma'am? Because without it come sundown, my hands are still tied, and that land is still his." And into the silence that followed, a voice from the back of the crowd said, "I got it." Everyone turned. Roy Danswell stood at the edge of the street with his hat in his hands and his ruined left hand curled against his chest, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, because he hadn't. He came forward slow through a crowd that parted from him, the way it had parted from Voss, because they all knew what Roy was, and Roy knew they knew. "I got his hand, Marshal," Roy said, "in writing. Every letter Voss sent me, paying me to spy on this ranch, telling me what he wanted and when. In his own words, in his own hand." He pulled a packet from inside his coat, folded and worn from being carried and taken out and put back 100 times. He wrote things down he shouldn't have. Men like that always do. They get to feeling safe. Roy's jaw worked. There's one where he says he's wanted the black mare back 8 months since the fool at the auction let her slip. There's one where he says the note was near bought, and once he had it, the widow's papers wouldn't matter. He held the packet out toward the marshal, and his hand was shaking. It's all here. Everything he paid me to help him do. Nobody breathed. Why? William said. His voice was low, and it was not kind. You sold us to that man Roy. You'd have watched us put off this land and taken his money for it. Why bring that in now? Roy looked at him, and then he looked up at Margaret on the horse, and whatever was left of the hard thing in him came apart. Because of her, Roy said. Because I threw a chain at that horse to get her trampled, and she stood there and gentled it anyway, and never once come at me the way I'd have come at her. Because I bet $10 a fat widow would be gone by Thursday, and instead she done the one thing this whole territory said couldn't be done, and she did it with patience I never had for one living soul in my life. His voice broke. I've been a mean small man my whole life, and I took that man's money, and I could not spend $1 of it. It's still in my boot. Every cent. He turned to the marshal. I don't expect it buys me anything. I know what I am. But that man made me help him hurt the only person that ever done a decent thing where I could see it, and I will not carry it another day. Take the letters. Hang me alongside him if the law says to. I'm done being what he made me. Marshal Boone took the packet. He read the top letter, and then the next, and the crowd watched his face change, watched the tired old lawman go from doubtful to something else entirely. Well, Boone said, very quiet. Well now. He folded the letters careful and put them inside his own coat next to the star. That's a man's own hand describing his own scheme. That's what I needed. He looked up. That changes things considerable. But it was Harlan Crane who broke it wide open. The banker had been trying to slip away the whole time, edging his gray horse toward the alley, and Marshal Boone said without even raising his voice, Mr. Crane, you'll want to stay right where you are. And Crane froze, and something in him, some last thread that had been fraying since the morning he took Voss's money, snapped clean through. He made me, Crane blurted. All the color was gone out of him. Voss, the clause, the calling of the note, all of it. He wrote the clause himself and told me to put it in, or he'd ruin me too. He's been buying paper off my bank for years, and I knew, God help me, I knew what he was doing with it, and I told myself it wasn't my business. Oi. He was shaking now, the whole town watching. He come to me this week and made me sell him the Hawthorne note early, at a price that told me plain he meant to take the land, not collect on it. I did it. I did it because I was afraid of him, and because the money was good, and I am so ashamed I can hardly stand up in this saddle. He looked at William, wretched. Your daddy came to me once, years back, trying to warn folks what Voss was. And I told him to hush before he got himself in trouble. I've thought on that 1,000 nights. I'll testify to every bit of it, Marshal. I don't care what it costs me anymore. It can't cost more than the last 14 years have. Marshal Boone had been reading the rest of Roy's packet while Crane talked, and now he went still over one page and read it twice and looked up slow. There's one more thing here folks ought to hear, Boone said, since it's the reason that horse near came apart today. He held the letter up. Voss writes to Danswell about the mare, and he don't guard his words on account of he never figured anybody but Danswell would read them. He read from it directly careful. The animal would not submit to correction, and I do not keep what I cannot use. I had it culled and sent to the low auction, where I was assured it would be destroyed. That it lives at all is a clerk's mistake I mean to correct. Boone lowered the page. Would not submit to correction. Culled. Destroyed. That's how a man writes about a horse he beat near to death, and then paid to have killed off when she wouldn't quit fighting him. He looked at the black mare standing quiet at Margaret's side. She didn't come to that auction by luck, ma'am. She came because some clerk couldn't stomach the order and shipped her off alive instead of dead. That's how close this animal come. And that's why she's the one thing on God's earth Edward Voss couldn't abide leaving breathing. She's not just a witness to what he is. She's the one creature that looked that man in the eye and would not break, and he never once forgave her for it. Tia. The street was dead silent. Margaret's hand found the black neck and pressed there, and the mare leaned into her, and Margaret had to look away a moment before she could trust her own voice. And there it was, not a spooked horse, not a widow's speech. A pattern 14 years long, and the schemer's own letters, and a banker's confession, and 4 ruined families standing in one street at last, all of it come together in the space of a quarter hour because a woman had refused to break when the whole town waited for her to. Margaret dismounted then. Her legs were unsteady under her, but she got down and she led the black mare through the crowd to where the men stood, and she stopped in front of Ephraim Doyle and the others, the ruined ones, the ones who'd carried their shame alone for 14 years, thinking they were simply unlucky. You weren't unlucky, she told them, and her voice shook. Not one of you. You were robbed by a patient, clever, cruel man who counted on your shame to keep you quiet. And it worked. For 14 years it worked. Because that's the whole of how men like him win. They make you believe the ruin is yours to be ashamed of, instead of theirs to answer for. She looked around at all of them. I know that feeling in my bones. I've had a whole town look at me and decide what I was worth before I opened my mouth. So I'll tell you what I finally learned, and it's the truest thing I know. She put her hand on the black mare's neck. People call a thing broken when they haven't got the patience to understand it. This horse wasn't broken. She was hurt, and hiding it the only way she knew. You men weren't broken. You were wronged, and hiding it the only way you knew. And there is not one broken thing standing in this street today. There's only a lot of good folk who were made to feel ashamed of surviving something they never deserved. Nobody said anything for a moment. And then old Pettigrew took his hat off, and then Doyle did, and then one after another down the length of the street, the men of Red Hollow bared their heads to the widow they'd laughed at. And it was the finest silence Margaret Collins had ever stood inside of. Then somebody said, "Rider coming," and every head turned to the ranch road because the sun was low now, and low sun meant sundown, and sundown meant Edward Voss. He came back in the lacquered buggy, unhurried, a man arriving to collect a thing already his. He had brought a second man with him this time, a sour-faced fellow with papers under his arm, some clerk or lawyer he'd fetched to make the taking official. He stepped down and looked at the crowd still gathered, and the smile he wore said he thought they'd come to watch him win. "Sundown Hawthorne," Voss called out pleasant. "Or near enough. You got my $3,000? No, I didn't think you would." He turned to Boone. "Marshal, I believe you've got a duty to perform. This land's mine legal and filed, and I'll have these people off it. All of them. Starting with the widow and that mad horse." "Mr. Voss," Boone said, "I've been reading your mail." Voss went still. "Roy Danswell brought me every letter you ever sent him." Boone went on easy as anything, patting the coat over his heart. "In your own hand. About the mare. About the note. About what your papers wouldn't matter once you owned the ground. And Mr. Crane here's been telling me about a clause you wrote yourself and 4 ruined spreads with your name on the papers and a 14-year habit of selling dying stock to honest men and buying them out of the wreckage." He walked his horse forward until he sat looking down at Edward Voss. "So here's where we are. A foreclosure a man gets by fraud isn't worth the paper it's filed on. I can't hand you this land. What I can do and what I'm going to do is put you under arrest and hold you and Mr. Crane both, and send the whole of it up to a federal grand jury in the territorial capital. Land fraud across a territory using the mails over the better part of 14 years. He almost smiled. "That's a federal matter, Mr. Voss. That's not a thing you buy your way past with a country bank." For one moment, Edward Voss stood there, and the whole scheme of 14 years came down around him in a single quarter hour, and Margaret watched the smooth, certain face come apart, watched the smile she'd hated fall off it for good. Then Voss lunged for the horse, Nobody expected it. He came at the black mare with his face twisted, some last mad instinct to destroy the one thing that had undone him, his hand going into his coat for a small pistol he'd carried the whole time, and the crowd screamed and fell back, and for a heartbeat, the mare he'd ruined stood square in the path of the man who'd ruined her. And Midnight did not run. She had spent a lifetime learning to fear that man, and 8 months learning the only safe thing was to flee, and a handful of weeks learning from one patient widow that she never had to run again. And the black mare planted her feet between Edward Voss and Margaret Collins, and screamed and reared up over him full height, 16 hands of the animal he'd broken and never once managed to own, and Voss stumbled back with his arm thrown up and his pistol going off wild into the dirt. And by the time he'd caught his footing, Marshal Boone was off his horse with a gun to the back of Voss's neck, and Caleb Turner had his wrist in a grip like a bear trap, and it was over. "That horse just saved your life, Mrs." Boone said, hauling Voss up. "He'd have shot you, sure." And she stood him down. He shook his head. "In 30 years of wearing this star, I never saw the like." They took the pistol off him, and they bound his hands, and Harlan Crane's too, and the sour-faced clerk dropped his papers in the dirt, and wanted no part of any of it. And the crowd, the same red hollow that had laughed a widow off its boardwalk months ago, closed in around the two ruined men, not with violence, but with something colder and better, the plain contempt of decent folk who have finally seen a thing clear. Voss twisted around in the marshal's grip and found Margaret one last time, and there was nothing left in his face but the venom. "You think you've won something?" he spat. "A horse and a piece of dirt. You'll see. Men like me, we don't—" "You're not a man like anything, Mr. Voss," Margaret said quiet, and she stepped close to him, though William put out a hand to stop her, and she looked into his face without a scrap of fear. "You're a small, frightened creature that learned it could take from folks weaker than you, and got clever at it, and called the cleverness strength. But you never once had the thing you were trying to steal." She reached back and laid her hand on the black mare's neck, and the mare leaned into her calm, now unafraid. "You had this horse a whole year, and she'd have died before she let you touch her. I had her a month, and she just stepped in front of a bullet for me. That's the difference between us, and it's the only difference that was ever going to matter." She stepped back. "Take him away, Marshal. He's taken up enough of everybody's 14 years. They put Edward Voss in the back of his own lacquered buggy with his hands bound, and Marshal Boone drove it off toward the territorial capital, with Crane roped behind, and the sun went down on Hawthorne Ranch, still belonging to the Hawthorns. The note fraud unraveled the past that had reached out 14 years to strangle a good family, finally fully dragged into the light. The crowd didn't leave. That was the thing Margaret noticed as the buggy dwindled down the road. Nobody went home. The men who'd bared their heads to her, the 4 ruined families, the shopkeep, the tall woman from the boardwalk, they all just stood in the street, in the last of the light, unwilling to let go of the thing they'd been part of. Ephraim Doyle came and stood in front of William Hawthorne and put out his hand. "Your daddy tried to warn us, son," Doyle said, "all them years ago, and we didn't listen, and we let a good man carry it alone. That's on this town, not on him, and not on you." He gripped William's hand hard. "We aim to make it right. There's a fund gets raised come the trial for lawyers and such. We're all of us in it. You won't fight that man in a courtroom alone. Not after today." He looked over at Margaret and the mare. "None of us will ever be alone in front of him again, on account of her. And Roy Danswell standing off apart the way a man stands when he isn't sure he's allowed to be among people anymore." Watched Margaret across the emptying street, and she caught his eye, and she did the thing that undid him worse than the letters had. She nodded to him. Once. The way you nod to a man you count. Roy ducked his head, and his shoulders shook, and he turned and walked off into the dusk alone. But he walked. Margaret noticed toward the church at the end of the street, and not toward the saloon. And she thought that a man who chooses that road, even the once, even this late, has already started being somebody new. William came and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while. The mare grazed at the edge of the street. The town murmured low and warm around them. The land, his father's land, lay safe in the gold light behind them, still theirs. "You sent for the marshal a week ago," William said finally. "You planned all of it. The exhibition, the town, the law being here to see. You knew Voss would try something, and you built the whole thing so that whatever he tried, there'd be witnesses and a lawman to see it." "I knew he'd have an answer to the horse," Margaret said. "I didn't know it'd be the note. That near beat me." She let out a long breath. "But I've spent my whole life being underestimated, William. I know exactly what it does to a person being sure they've already won. It makes them careless. It makes them say the quiet thing out loud in front of a crowd." She looked up at him. "So I gave him a crowd. And I let him win right up until he'd bragged himself into a corner he couldn't buy his way out of. Voss lost today for the same reason your father lost 14 years ago. He was too sure of a thing he'd already decided." A small, tired smile. "Only this time, the person he was sure about had spent 32 years learning to turn that against a man." William looked at her a long moment. This woman who'd stepped off a stagecoach with a suitcase and a letter, and everybody in town already certain of what she was worth. "They laughed you off that boardwalk," he said. "Your first hour here." "They did. And today, an entire town took its hat off to you in the middle of Main Street." Margaret watched the last of the light go gold, and then rose over the hills, and she put her hand once more on the neck of the black mare. No man could ride the impossible horse, and the underestimated woman standing easy together in a town that had run out of anything left to doubt. "They did that too," she said softly. "Turns out the distance between those two things was never as far as everybody believed. It was only ever about who was willing to be patient enough to walk it." The walking took the rest of that summer. Because a man like Edward Voss does not fall in a single afternoon on a dusty street, no matter how many hats come off to a widow. He fell slow the way he'd risen, and he did not fall quiet. Word came up from this territorial capital within the week that Voss had money set by that no marshal had found, and that he'd used it to fetch a lawyer clear from Denver, a smooth, famous man named Alistair Fenn, who had never lost a case he'd been paid enough to win. And the word that came with it was worse. Fenn had looked over the whole matter and pronounced it thin. A pattern was not a crime. Letters could be called forgeries. A nervous horse was not evidence of anything but a nervous horse. And the chief witness against Edward Voss was a grasping fat widow with a struggling rancher on her arm and a clear reason to want the man who held their note put away. "He's going to walk," William said the night that word reached the ranch. He had the letter from the territorial attorney in his hand, and his face had gone gray. "Fenn's already filed to have the letters thrown out. Says there's no proving Voss wrote them. And if the letters go, Margaret, there's no proof he meant any of it. It all falls apart. He walks out of that courtroom, and he comes back here, and he starts again, and this time he knows exactly who to break first." Margaret took the letter and read it twice slow and set it down. "Then we don't let the letters carry it alone," she said. "We never should have counted on paper against a man who lives by paper. Paper's his country, William. We beat him once by making him stand in front of people. We'll do it again. With what Fenn'll tear every one of us apart on that stand. He'll make Doyle look like a bitter old man. He'll make Crane look like he's lying to save his own neck. And he'll make you—" William stopped. "Say it. He'll make you look like exactly what this town thought you were the day you stepped off that coach," William said quietly. "A woman who came from nothing, wanting something. He'll stand you up in front of a jury and make 32 years of your life into a motive." His jaw worked. "I can't ask you to walk into that. Not for my land. You've given enough." Margaret was quiet a moment. "You're not asking me," she said. "I'm telling you. I've been underestimated in front of worse rooms than a courtroom, William Hawthorne, and I'm still standing. Let the man from Denver do his worst." She picked the letter back up and folded it away. "He's going to build his whole case on me being small. That's the one mistake every man in my life has ever made, and I have made a habit of outlasting it. Caleb Turner came to her the night before they left for the capital. He stood in the kitchen doorway, a long moment working his hat, the way he did when a thing was hard for him to say. "I told you something your first afternoon here," he said finally. "I told you this land breaks people stronger than you. And I meant it kind. God's truth I did. I thought I was saving you a world of hurt." He turned the hat over. "I have never in my life been so wrong about a person, and I've been wrong plenty. You didn't get broke by this land, Mrs. Collins. You unbroke half of what was already broken on it. That horse, that ranch, Roy Danswell of all the lost causes, me." His voice went rough. "I was a hard old man losing his faith in gentle things, and you sat on a crate every morning and reminded me what my own daddy taught me before I forgot it doing things the hard way for 40 years. He put the hat back on. "So you go down to that Capitol, and you let that Denver man call you small. I'll be sitting right behind you the whole time, and I'll know the truth of it, and so will every soul from Red Hollow in that room. You're the strongest thing that ever come up that road, and I'd be proud to say so to any jury in the territory." "You see it." Margaret couldn't speak for a moment. "You called me strong," she managed. "It only took you a year." "I'm a slow study," Caleb said, "but I get there." And he almost smiled and went out into the dark. They went down to the Capitol in October, the whole of them a wagon train of witnesses winding out of Red Hollow. Doyle and Hollis and Pettigrew and the fourth ruined man, a quiet farmer named Amos Kettle, who'd lost his wife to the worry of it. Crane pale and resolved. Caleb and Josiah and Samuel. And Roy Danswell, who had come to the ranch 2 weeks after the arrest, hat in hand, and asked William for work, and had been told by Margaret before William could answer that a man who wanted to be somebody new had to be given somewhere to become it, and had been sleeping in the bunkhouse and mending fence ever since, quiet and hard-working, and watched. The courtroom was full, and Alistair Fenn was everything they'd feared. He rose in a fine coat and spoke like honey pouring, and he took the letters apart, first the way he'd promised. No witness had seen Voss write them. The hand could be anyone's. A jilted, dismissed ranch hand with a grudge could have penned every word himself to sink the man who'd fired him. He turned to Roy in the gallery with a smile. "Isn't that so, Mr. Danswell? You did hate my client. You've admitted taking his money and then turning on him. Why should any man here believe a word you say?" And it looked for a while like it was working. The jury's faces went doubtful. Doyle got flustered under Fenn's questioning and contradicted himself on a date 14 years gone. Fenn made Crane sweat until the banker's confession sounded like the desperate lie of a man trading another's freedom for his own. Piece by piece, the smooth man from Denver took the truth Margaret had built and made it look like the spite of poor, bitter people ganging up on a wealthy one. Then he called Margaret to the stand. "Mrs. Collins." Fenn said, warm and terrible, "You came to Red Hollow with nothing. Isn't that right? A widow, penniless, the bank having taken your home. You arrived at a struggling ranch, and within months you had the owner's affections, the run of the place, and a stake in whether its debts were paid or forgiven." He turned to the jury. "Now a rich man appears holding that ranch's note, and you have crafted a most remarkable story. A horse that hates him. Letters no one saw him write. A pattern from 14 years ago." He faced her again. "I put it to you plainly, Mrs. Collins. You are a woman who had nothing who found a way to something, and who will say anything to keep it. That's the truth of this, isn't it? Strip away the horse and the theater, and this is a grasping woman protecting her prize." The courtroom held its breath. It was the moment Fenn had built his whole case toward the widow made small in front of everyone, and William in the gallery closed his eyes. Margaret let the silence sit. She was good at silence. She'd learned it from a horse. "Mr. Fenn," she said at last, "even and clear, you've spent the better part of an hour telling this jury I'm a woman who came from nothing and wants something, and you've said it like it's a sin." She folded her hands. "So let me agree with you, since it seems to be the whole of your case. I did come from nothing. I buried my husband with money I didn't have, and I watched a bank take our home while I was still wearing black, and I got on a stagecoach going west with one suitcase and one letter and no notion at all of what waited at the end of the road. That's all true. I won't dress it up for you." She looked at the jury now, not at Fen. "But here's the part your fine speech left out. A woman who has lost everything and kept walking anyway is not a woman you can frighten with a courtroom. She is not a woman who needs to lie for a ranch, because she has already lived through losing more than a ranch and come out the other side still standing. You built your whole case on the idea that having nothing makes a person desperate and dishonest." Her voice went quiet and hard. "It doesn't, sir. It makes them free. There is nothing left in this world you can take from me that I haven't already survived losing. Which means I am the one witness in this room your client's money can't reach and your words can't bend. And I think deep down you knew that the moment you decided to make my grief into a motive. Because a man only attacks a woman's whole life when he can't lay a finger on the thing she actually said." The courtroom was dead silent. A juror in the back had his hand over his mouth. "Now ask me about the horse," Margaret said. "Ask me what I saw. Because I am done being made small by clever men, and I have got the truth, and I will tell it plain to every soul in this room, whether it costs me a ranch, or my good name, or the last thing I own. That's the difference between me and your client, Mr. Fen. I've got nothing left to protect. So, there is no lie I need to tell." Fen had no more questions. He tried after that. He was too good not to try. But the ground had shifted under him, and every man on that jury felt it, and when the four families told their stories again, they told them steady, because a woman had just shown them how and when Roy Danswell took the stand, he did the thing Fen could not have prepared for. "He's right that I hated Voss," Roy said, looking at the jury, not at the lawyer. "And he's right I took his money. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm a good man because I ain't, and everybody in Red Hollow can tell you so." He turned his ruined hand over on the rail. "But I'll tell you why I brought them letters in, and you can decide, does a liar do this? I brought them in knowing they might hang me right alongside him. I gave up the only thing I had to trade my own skin, and I got nothing for it, and I wanted nothing for it. And if you think a grasping, lying man gives up his own neck for a widow who was kind to him one time when nobody else on God's earth ever was, then you go on and think it." His voice cracked. "I done a bad thing helping that man. This is me trying to do one right thing before I die. That's all it is. That's the whole of it. You cannot cross-examine that." Fen knew it. He sat down. The jury was out 40 minutes. Guilty on every count. Land fraud, mail fraud, the whole 14-year architecture of it. The judge voided every note Voss had ever bought through the scheme, which meant the ruined spreads, Doyles and Hollises, and Pettigrews and Kettles came back to the men who'd worked them free and clear 14 years late. Restitution ordered from what money of Voss's the marshals could find. And Edward Voss, who had walked into a Wyoming town, certain he could not lose, was led out of that courtroom in irons toward a federal prison, and he did not look at the widow as he passed because he could not, because the one creature that had ever refused to break in front of him was standing in that gallery still refusing, and he had run clean out of ways to make her small. Crane got 5 years, and took it like a man setting down a weight. Roy the judge let go with a warning and a hard word on account of he'd turned, and Roy walked out of that courthouse a free man and stood on the steps blinking like he'd forgotten daylight was allowed to fall on him too. Margaret found him there. "You've got a bunk at Hawthorne, as long as you want it," she said. "And honest work. If you want to be somebody new, that's the ground to do it on." Roy looked at her a long while. "Why?" he said. "After everything. Why'd you go to bat for me in there? Why'd you give me the bunk? I threw a chain at that horse to get you killed, missus. I have never once done a thing to earn a scrap of kindness from you." "No," Margaret agreed. "You haven't. That's exactly what makes it kindness and not payment." She put a hand on his shoulder brief. "I know what it is to have a whole town decide what you are before you get a say, Roy. It near broke me. I'll not do it to another living soul, not even one who's earned it. You get to become somebody new. That's not me being soft." That's me refusing to let a man like Voss decide even one more life, yours included." She turned to go. "Fence line's waiting. Come home when you're ready." And Roy Danswell put his ruined hand over his eyes on the courthouse steps and wept like a boy. And then he wiped his face, and he went home to the ranch, and he became over the years that followed the steadiest hand on the place, and the first to stand up for any stranger. The town was quick to judge because he had been that stranger once, and a widow had refused to leave him there. They came back to Red Hollow to a different life. The ranch that had been dying was suddenly the ranch that had beaten Edward Voss, and the black mare that folks had wanted shot was suddenly the most famous animal in the territory. The horse that stood down a bullet and helped bring down the man who'd ruined 4 families. Buyers came now, real ones, honest ones, and they came for Midnight's line exactly as William had dreamed the day he bought her at that auction for more than he could afford, on nothing but a feeling that she was worth saving. She foaled the next spring. A black colt sound, and bold with his mother's build, and none of her fear, because he was born on ground where no man ever came at him with a rope. Margaret was there for it in the dark of the barn, her hands the first to touch him, and when the little thing struggled up on his legs and butted at her for milk, she found she was crying again, the way she seemed to do now over every good thing, having spent so many years with nothing good to cry about. "You did that," William said beside her. "Everybody said she was ruined past mending. And there's her son not 1 day old, and he doesn't know the word afraid. Because of you." "Because of her," Margaret said, watching the mare nose her colt. "She's the one that decided to trust the world one more time. I just sat on a crate and waited for her to." She wiped her face. "That's all any of us ever needed. Somebody patient enough to wait for us to decide we were safe." The ranch prospered. Not all at once, but sure. The colt's line became the thing that put Hawthorne Ranch back on its feet, and then past it, and the money came in, and the fences got mended, and the hands got their full wages at last. And Josiah stopped talking about his burial rag, because there wasn't going to be any pauper's hole for a man who'd stood up first in the street when it mattered. But there was one thing that hadn't mended, and Margaret carried it quiet through all of it, and it was the last thing, and it was in her. Because William had asked her to marry him the week they came home from the trial, standing at the corral in the evening, with his hat in his hands like a boy. And she had said the thing she never expected to say. She had said, "Not yet." "I love you," she'd told him, and meant it down to the ground. "You know I do. But William, it's not even been 6 months since I put Thomas in the earth. And here I am with a whole new life, a home, a man who's good to me, and every time I let myself be happy in it, there's a voice says, 'What right have you? He's barely cold. You loved him. And you're already laughing again with both hands down, and it feels like I'm leaving him behind in the ground alone.'" Her voice had broken. "I can't marry you carrying that. It's not fair to you. And it's not fair to him." And William, God bless him, had not argued. He'd only said, "Then we'll wait, as long as it takes. I've got no clock on this, Margaret. I waited 4 years to feel anything again. I can wait however long it takes you to forgive yourself for surviving." And he'd kissed her forehead, and let her be, and that patience had near undone her more than any pushing could have. She carried it into the winter, and it was Josiah in the end who set it down for her without meaning to, the way the truest help usually comes. He found her one evening at the kitchen table with Thomas's last letter open in front of her, the worn one, the one she'd carried against her heart off the stagecoach a lifetime ago. She read it maybe once a week still. She thought she'd worn every word of it smooth. "That your husband's hand?" Josiah asked, setting down the coffee. "His last one." She smoothed it. "The morning the fever took his sense. He wrote it and propped it on the washstand, and I found it after." She read it out low because Josiah had earned the hearing of it. "You are the strongest thing I ever loved. Don't let them tell you different. Go west if you have to. Just don't stop." Josiah was quiet a while. "Just don't stop," he repeated. "That's a strange thing for a dying man to write his widow, ain't it? Most men they'd write, 'Wait for me. Grieve me proper. Don't forget me.'" He scratched his jaw. This one wrote, "Go. Keep going. Don't stop." He looked at her, gentle, an old man who'd seen enough to know a thing when it was in front of him. Mrs., I don't think that man wrote you a letter about missing him. I think he wrote you a letter giving you leave. To go. To live. To find whatever come next. He picked up his own cup. You've been reading that as a chain around your ankle. I believe he meant it for a key. And Margaret Collins sat at that table and read the letter one more time, and for the first time in a lifetime of reading it, she read it the way it had been written, not by a man begging her to stay behind in his grave with him, but by a man who loved her so well that his very last act on this earth was to open the door and tell her to walk through it. Just don't stop. He hadn't meant don't stop grieving. He'd meant don't stop living. He had known he was dying, and he had used the last clear words he'd ever have not to hold her, but to free her. She wept then, hard the way you weep when a thing you've carried wrong for months finally comes right in your hands. And when she was done, she folded the letter and she kissed it, and she put it away in the drawer where she kept the precious things, and she did not take it out to torment herself with ever again, because she understood at last that Thomas had never once asked her to. She found William at the corral in the morning. You asked me a thing in the fall, she said, and I told you not yet, and I've come to give you a different answer if the offer's still standing. William turned. His breath had gone still. It's standing, he said. It'll be standing when I'm 90. Then yes, said Margaret Collins. Yes, I'll marry you, William Hawthorne. I've spent months feeling like being happy was a betrayal of a good man. And this morning, I finally understood that the only way I'd truly betray him is by refusing the life he used his last breath to hand me. Her eyes were shining. Thomas told me to go west and not stop. Well, I went west, and I found you and a horse nobody wanted and a whole town that took its hat off to me in the end. She stepped into his arms. I'm not stopping, William. I'm just finally letting myself arrive. They married in the spring, a year almost to the day since a stagecoach had left a widow standing alone at the edge of a town that laughed at her. The whole of Red Hollow came. The tall woman from the boardwalk cried through the entire thing, and afterward pressed her own recovered wedding ring into Margaret's hand as a gift, and would not take it back. Ephraim Doyle, whose land was his own again, gave the widow away, at her asking, walking her up on his weathered arm with tears standing in his eyes, because his own daughter had died young, and Margaret had told him she'd be honored to stand in that empty place for a day. Caleb Turner, who had told a fat widow on her first afternoon that this land breaks people stronger than her, stood up as William's man and could not get through his few words without stopping twice. Josiah cooked for 200 and refused all help. Samuel, grown into himself, now danced every dance. And Roy Danswell stood at the very back where he always stood and watched, and when Margaret caught his eye across the crowd, he did not duck his head this time. He nodded to her. Once. The way you nod to somebody you count. And midnight was there, of course. Margaret would not have married without her. The black mare that no man could ride stood saddled and gleaming at the edge of it all, with her bold black colt beside her. And after the vows, Margaret went to her still in her wedding dress and pressed her forehead to that great black neck, the way she had 100 mornings on a feed crate, and the mare leaned into her easy, unafraid, and the whole town watched the two of them. The impossible horse and the woman nobody had wanted, and understood that they were looking at the same miracle twice. That evening, when the dancing had wound down, and the guests had gone, and the light lay long and gold over the land that was truly theirs, now William found Margaret out by the corral, with the mare the way he'd known he would. You came here, he said, coming to stand beside her, believing you had nothing left in the whole world. Margaret looked out over the ranch, over the mended fences and the full barns, and the colt kicking up his heels in the last of the light over the impossible distance she had walked from a suitcase and a letter to this. I did, she said softly. I stepped off that coach so certain the best part of my life was already in the ground behind me, that all I had left was the not stopping. She put her hand on the black mare's neck, and the mare turned and breathed warm against her cheek. I was wrong, William, about near everything. I thought I'd come to the end of my road. She smiled, and there was no hand over her mouth now, and there never would be again. Turns out, I just hadn't found where I belonged yet. They laughed her off the boardwalk her first hour in that town. They told her the land broke people stronger than her. They said the black mare was impossible, and the woman was finished, and the two of them together were nothing but a fool's errand nobody would remember by spring. They were wrong about all of it, because the woman everyone underestimated became the person who saved a family, freed a valley, and stood down the cruelest man in the territory, with nothing but the truth and the nerve to say it out loud. The horse everyone called impossible became the mother of a line that ran proud across 3 territories, and the proof to every soul who ever heard the story that there is no such thing as ruined, only wounded, and no such thing as broken, only misunderstood. And in the end, the town that had run a widow off its street took its hat off to her and gave her a home and a family, and a name that meant something, because Margaret Collins had shown them all a thing that a hard country too easily forgets, that the strongest people alive are almost never the ones who were never knocked down. They are the ones who got knocked all the way to the ground and lost everything that was ever supposed to hold them up, and stood back up anyway and kept walking and refused against every reason the world gave them to ever once stop believing that somewhere down that long and dusty road there was still a place where they belonged. She found hers, and she never once let anybody make her small again.